The mews stands against the inner face of the curtain wall, a long, low building of grey stone topped with dark thatch that glistens from the night's dampness. Its high, barred window faces east, and a sliver of pale gold is just beginning to touch the iron grating. You fit your hand around the rough, cool iron ring of the door and pull, feeling the weight of the oak as it swings toward you with a low groan from the hinges. The sound is so familiar that it scarcely registers, absorbed into the larger quiet of the courtyard as easily as a single drop of water into a still pond. As the door opens, the interior air washes outward, a blend of dried heather, seasoned wood, clean river sand, and the unmistakable warm feathered scent of a resting goshawk. You step inside, close the door gently, and let the latch fall into place with a soft, muted thud. For a few moments you simply stand with your back to the door, allowing your eyes to grow accustomed to the dimness. The only light comes from that single high window and from the faint orange glow of an iron brazier set against the far wall, its embers banked with ash from the night before. Gradually, the shapes of the room reveal themselves, emerging from the shadow like objects rising through clear, still water. To your left, a row of plain wooden perches stretches along the wall, most of them empty now, because the Baron took his best birds with him to the Holy Land, leaving only this one large female goshawk in your care. Opposite the perches, a sturdy shelf holds the tools of the falconer's trade, a set of brass scales, a small anvil for mending jesses, spools of waxed linen thread, several soft leather hoods folded neatly, and a clay jar of oil for conditioning the metal. Below the shelf sits a three-legged stool and a work table scarred with countless tiny cuts from a sharp knife. The floor is strewn with clean straw, and under the perches, a layer of pale river sand catches any castings or droppings. Your gaze moves to the far end of the mews, where the goshawk waits on her block perch. She is a big, powerful female, her slate-grey back feathers smooth as polished stone, her breast barred with fine horizontal lines of white and soft grey. In the half-light, her deep orange eyes look almost black, and she watches you with an expression that is neither hostile nor welcoming but simply patient, as if the passing of hours means nothing to her. Her block perch is a broad, flat-topped piece of oak, padded with layers of felt and soft leather, and it sits on a low wooden platform that raises her slightly above the floor. She stands on one foot, the other tucked up into her breast feathers, her head turned slightly to one side. Her leather jesses hang in loose loops from the perch ring, and the small brass bell on her tail deck feather glints faintly when she shifts her weight. You take a moment to observe the goshawk without moving closer, letting her accept your presence as part of the ordinary shape of the morning. The air inside the mews is noticeably warmer than the bailey outside, kept mild by the stone walls and the residual heat of the brazier, and it carries a depth of quiet that is different from the stillness you just left. Out in the courtyard, the silence felt temporary, the promise of soon-to-arrive servants and the cook stirring the kitchen fire. Here in the mews, the silence is permanent, a foundational element of the space built up over days and weeks of slow, careful routine. It wraps around the perches, the scales, the coiled jesses, and the sleeping bird like a second skin. You let your eyes travel over the familiar details of the room, noting small things that have not changed since yesterday evening. The water dish beside the goshawk's perch still holds a shallow pool of clean water, its surface perfectly still, showing a tiny reflection of the window above. The leather gauntlet you left on the work table is exactly where you placed it, its cuff turned down and its palm darkened from years of handling hawks. The small broom made of birch twigs leans in its corner, and the covered basket you use for carrying meat from the larder sits on the floor near the door, empty and waiting. The brass scales on the shelf hang from their hook with the counterweights in place, the tray and perch attachment resting beside them, all polished to a low gleam. Against the opposite wall, a stack of clean straw bales and a sack of river sand provide the raw materials for the day's cleaning, their bulk reassuring in its solid plainness. You become aware of the slight chill still clinging to your own clothing, the sleeves of your woolen tunic damp from the mist outdoors, and you decide to move closer to the brazier before beginning any work. Your footsteps make a soft, shuffling sound in the straw as you cross the room, and the goshawk's head turns to follow your movement. But she does not rouse or fluff her feathers in alarm. You reach the brazier and hold your hands near its warmth, feeling the blood return to your fingertips, and you notice the small pile of kindling and split logs kept ready for feeding the fire later in the day. The brazier itself is a simple iron basket on legs, its sides blackened with soot, and the embers inside glow with a steady, pulsing light that shifts in tiny patterns as the air moves. Standing there, you look back across the mews and see the whole length of it in one view: the row of empty perches, the work table, the door, the high window with its slowly brightening square of sky, and the goshawk at her perch, a stillness within stillness. The light from the window strengthens by small degrees, changing from grey to silver to a pale watery gold. A single thin sunbeam falls across the sand floor and illuminates a patch of straw, making the individual stalks glow like fine threads of spun glass. Dust motes drift in slow circles through the beam, rising and falling on invisible currents, and the whole scene has the quality of a manuscript illumination, every detail held in a calm, golden suspension. The distant sound of a blackbird begins somewhere outside, a series of liquid notes that rise and fall without urgency, and you hear, very faintly, the first stirrings of the castle, waking, the distant clank of the well chain, the muffled thump of a shutter being opened, the cook's voice calling something indistinct. All these sounds arrive in the mews softened and flattened, as if they have travelled a great distance through layers of wool and stone. You turn back toward the goshawk, knowing that the day's first task will be to inspect her closely, but not yet. There is no need to hurry. The routine that governs your days in the Baron's absence does not run by the castle bells or the position of the sun, but by the bird's own cycles of hunger and rest. She was fed yesterday at the same hour, weighed in the morning, and again at evening, and her digestion will follow its own slow, steady course, regardless of anything you do. So you allow yourself a few more minutes of stillness, standing beside the brazier with your hands loosely clasped, listening to the quiet sounds of the mews. The faint tick of the cooling brazier iron, the soft rustle of the goshawk's feathers as she preens a covert feather under her wing, the barely audible creak of the thatch settling overhead. Each sound is small enough that you could miss it if you are not paying attention, and together they form a kind of rhythm, a breath-like pulse that belongs entirely to this place. You think, without any particular urgency, about the tasks ahead. The goshawk must be taken from her perch and placed on the weighing scale, her weight noted and compared to yesterday's figure. Then you will walk to the larder to select a pigeon or a partridge, dress it, and prepare the morsels for her single daily meal. The feeding itself will occupy the better part of an hour, done slowly and with long pauses. After that, you will clean the perch, change the sand, refresh the water, and perhaps inspect her feathers for any sign of damage or parasites. All of it is familiar, threaded into your memory so deeply that your hands know what to do without conscious thought, and yet each day feels distinct in its small variations, the particular way the light falls, the weight of the bird, the texture of the meat, the number of castings she produces. There is a gentle interest in these details, a quiet attention that keeps the hours from becoming featureless. The goshawk finishes her preening and resettles, tucking her foot back up into her breast feathers and letting her eyelids droop to half-mast. Her beak is closed, the curved tip resting neatly against the feathers of her throat, and her breathing is so shallow that her breast barely moves. She looks like a carved figure, an emblem of patience wrought in feather and bone. You have seen her like this hundreds of times, in the early morning, in the late afternoon, in the deep quiet of a winter night when you came to check the brazier, and each time the sight produces the same slow spreading calm in your chest, a feeling that everything is as it should be. You leave the brazier and walk slowly toward the work table, taking up the leather gauntlet and pulling it onto your left hand with practiced, unhurried movements. The leather is warm and supple, shaped to the curve of your knuckles, and it smells faintly of the oil you use to keep it from cracking. You flex your fingers inside the glove, feeling the familiar resistance, then lift the brass weighing scale from its shelf and hook it over the wooden beam above the weighing perch. The perch itself is a simple T-shaped stand, its crossbar padded with the same soft felt as the block, and you set it on the hanging tray, centering it carefully so that the balance will read true. The scale needle quivers for a moment and then settles, pointing to 0. You adjust the counterweight slightly, nudging one of the small lead discs with your fingertip until the tray hangs perfectly level. Satisfied, you turn back to the goshawk, and now you move toward her with the slow, deliberate gait that she expects. Your body knows this approach so well that you do not have to think about the placement of your feet or the angle of your shoulders. You stop just out of arm's reach and let her see the glove, let her understand what is coming. Without any hurry, you reach out and press the back of your gloved hand gently against her breast feathers. Feeling the warmth of her body through the leather, she shifts her weight, uncurls her other foot from her plumage, and steps onto your fist with a single fluid motion, her talons gripping the glove with a firm, steady pressure. Her bell makes a tiny, silvery sound, a single clear note that hangs in the still air for a heartbeat and then fades. You straighten up, holding the goshawk at chest height, and for a long moment you simply stand there in the middle of the mews, a falconer and his bird suspended in the quiet before the day's first task begins. With the goshawk settled on your left fist, her talons curled firmly around the leather glove, and her weight pressing down in a way that feels both solid and delicately balanced, you stand motionless in the center of the mews for a long, measured interval. The bird's breast rises and falls against the back of your hand in a rhythm so shallow and slow that you must pay close attention to detect it at all. Her deep orange eyes, which in the dimness of the perch had seemed almost black, now catch the growing light from the high window and reveal flecks of russet and umber circling the dark pupils. She watches your face without blinking, her head held at a slight angle, and her whole posture communicates a guarded acceptance of this morning ritual. You feel the warmth of her body seeping through the thick leather, a steady, living heat that spreads across your knuckles and into the palm of your hand, and you spend a few more moments simply letting her grow accustomed to the changed position before beginning any closer examination. The light inside the mews has brightened a little since you first crossed the bailey, the single beam from the east window now falling in a broader, softer column that illuminates the floating dust and casts a pale glow on the sand floor near the weighing perch. Still, for a proper inspection of the bird's finer details, you need a stronger, more concentrated source of light. You turn slowly, moving your feet with care so as not to jostle the goshawk, and carry her toward the work table where a thick tallow candle stands in a simple iron holder. With your free right hand, you take a splint of kindling from the stack by the brazier, touch it to the glowing embers, and hold the tiny flame to the candle's wick. The wick catches with a small, sputtering hiss and then steadies into a tall, quiet flame, its amber tip weaving gently in the still air. You lift the candle holder and carry it back to the goshawk's block, setting it on the stone ledge that runs along the wall at shoulder height, where it casts a warm, steady circle of light across the perch, the sand below, and the bird now returning to your fist. With the candlelight supplementing the window's grey illumination, you begin the inspection by examining the goshawk's head and face, the parts of her that are nearest to your own eyes. Her head is rounded and smooth, the feathers lying flat in overlapping rows that shine faintly with an oily luster. You bring your right hand up slowly, letting the bird see every movement, and run the tip of your forefinger just above her cerri, the bare waxy skin at the base of her beak that houses her nostrils. The cerri is a soft, pale yellow-green, its surface slightly granulated like fine sandpaper, and it gives off a faint, clean scent reminiscent of dried hay. You check that the nostrils are open and free of any discharge or blockage, peering closely at the two small crescents of dark opening that expand and contract almost imperceptibly with each breath the goshawk takes. Her beak itself is a deep blue-black, curving downward to a sharply hooked tip, and you examine its edge for any cracks or uneven wear, finding it smooth and clean as a freshly whetted knife. The bird tolerates this handling with a patience that seems to come from deep instinct, her head turning only slightly when you touch the edge of her beak, and her eyes continue to watch you with that same calm, unblinking regard. You note the clarity of her pupils, the way they constrict slightly when you move the candle closer, and the even dark rim of the iris that holds no cloudiness or sign of irritation. A tiny feather, no larger than an eyelash, clings to the side of her face just below the eye, and you brush it away with the gentlest possible touch, feeling the soft, powdery texture of her facial feathers against your fingertip. She blinks once, a slow, deliberate closing and opening of the inner eyelid that moves horizontally across the eye like a fine, milky curtain, and then her gaze settles again into its previous steadiness. From the head, you move your inspection downward, tracing the line of her throat, where the feathers change from the soft, dense grey of her crown to the finely barred white and pale slate of her breast. Each feather on her chest is marked with horizontal waves, thin lines of grey alternating with white so evenly spaced that they look as if they were drawn with a fine brush by a patient scribe. You lift a single chest feather with the edge of your thumb, holding it up to the candlelight, and observe its structure. The stiff central shaft, the soft barbs branching outward, and the tiny interlocking barbules that hold everything together in a smooth, weatherproof surface. The feather lies back in place perfectly when you release it, and you repeat this gentle lifting and releasing across several points of her breast and belly, checking for any signs of feather lice or damage, finding nothing but the clean, healthy scent of warm plumage. The goshawk remains still on your fist throughout this slow examination, her talons adjusting their grip now and then with a slight squeeze that you feel as a subtle, pulsing pressure through the glove. Her bell, attached to the deck feather of her tail by a tiny leather bewit, gives a muted chime each time she shifts her weight, a sound so high and soft that it seems to belong more to the silence than to interrupt it. You step sideways, careful not to twist your body in a way that might unbalance the bird, and begin to inspect her back and wings. The upper surface of her wings and mantle is a different color from her breast, a deep, uniform slate gray that darkens along the edges of each feather, creating a faint scalloped pattern when the light hits it at an angle. You run the back of your finger along the leading edge of her folded wing, feeling the smooth, hard shafts of the primary feathers and the softer, more flexible coverts that overlay them. Now you decide to examine the wing more thoroughly, extending it just enough to see the flight feathers without causing the bird any discomfort. You know from long practice exactly how to do this. You slide your right hand along her side until your thumb and forefinger encircle the wing at the shoulder joint, and you apply the lightest outward pressure. The goshawk responds by slowly opening her wing, not in alarm, but in a kind of cooperative reflex, and she holds it partly extended while you inspect the 10 long primary feathers that form the wing's outer edge. Each primary is a dark, glossy brown-black on the underside and a paler, barred grey on the upper surface, and they lie in a clean, overlapping sequence like the slats of a finely made shutter. You run your fingertip along the quill of each feather, feeling for any softness or weakness, and you note the presence of several new pin feathers emerging from the skin, their shaft still wrapped in the pale blue keratin sheaths that protect the growing feather within. The sheaths are smooth and hard, showing no sign of being pecked or prematurely opened, and you judge them to be developing exactly as they should for this stage of the molt. You release the wing and let it fold back into place, the bird giving a small shake of her entire body that ruffles every feather from head to tail, and then settles them all back into perfect alignment with a sound like a soft deck of playing cards being shuffled. After the shake, she tucks her head briefly under her wing, preens a single covert feather at the shoulder, and then returns to her watchful posture. You wait for her to finish before continuing, and then you run your hand lightly down her back, feeling the firm, fleshy ridge of her spine beneath the feathers, the muscles on either side that power the wings, and the slight hollow at the base of the neck where the crop would bulge if she had eaten recently. Her crop is empty now, as you expect, and the flatness of the area confirms that yesterday's meal has passed fully into her stomach. You turn your attention to the bird's tail, which extends downward behind her in a long, straight fan of barred feathers that brush against the back of your glove. The tail feathers are longer than the wing feathers, each one banded with the same grey and white pattern as her breast, and you count 12 of them, all intact and evenly spaced. The deck feather, the central one to which the bell is attached, is slightly thicker than the others, and the bewit sits snugly around its base without pinching or twisting. You test the knot with a gentle tug, finding it secure, and check the small slit in the bell that releases its faint, silvery note. The brass of the bell is tarnished to a soft, brownish gold, and it bears a tiny engraved mark, the Baron's Falconry stamp, a guarantee of its craftsmanship. Having examined the feathers, you move to the bird's feet, the pale, yellow scaled legs that grip your glove with such constant, steady pressure. The skin of her legs is rough and knobbly, covered in small, shield-like scales that overlap like roof tiles, and the color is a healthy bright yellow with no patches of grey or flaking. You run your little finger under the jesses, the short leather straps that hang from each leg, checking for any stiffness or cracking in the leather, and any sign of rubbing against the bird's skin. The jesses are soft and pliable, darkened with age and handling but still strong, and the small brass eyelets that connect them to the leash ring are polished smooth. You lift one of her feet slightly, feeling the automatic tightening of her grip as you do, and examine the 4 talons, 3 pointing forward and 1 pointing back, each a curved obsidian black claw of remarkable sharpness. The talons are clean, without any caked blood or dirt, and the tips are needle-fine, honed by the bird's habit of raking them against the perch. You check the undersides of the feet, the padded, slightly pebbly skin that cushions her steps, finding it free of sores or swelling. Throughout this long methodical process, you have been aware of the other element of the morning's inspection that takes place not on the bird herself, but on the sand below her block. Now, with the bird still balanced on your fist, you step carefully toward the perch and look down at the area where she spent the night. The circle of candlelight, which you have brought with you by moving the holder to the edge of the perch platform, illuminates the fine pale river sand and the small grey pellet that lies upon it. This is the casting, the indigestible remains of yesterday's meal that the bird coughed up during the night, and its condition tells you a great deal about her internal health. You crouch slightly, keeping your gloved hand level so that the bird does not slip, and examine the casting at close range. It is a compact, oval mass about the length of your thumb, composed of matted fur and tiny fragments of bone, its surface slightly moist but firm. The color is a uniform grey-brown, indicating that the meal was properly digested and that the bird's stomach acids did their slow work in the dark hours. You note that the casting is whole and well-formed, not loose or fragmented, and you feel a quiet satisfaction at this small confirmation that all is well inside the bird's body. You leave the casting where it lies, knowing that you will remove it later when you clean the perch and replace the sand, and you straighten up again. The inspection has taken a span of time that you could not measure precisely if you tried, a slow, suspended interval filled entirely with the small details of feather, beak, talon, and skin. During all of it, the only sounds have been the soft rustle of the goshawk's plumage, the occasional chime of her bell, the whisper of your own breathing, and the distant, muffled noises of the castle continuing to stir beyond the thick stone walls. The candle flame burns steadily, its wax pooling in the holder and forming a small, clear lake around the wick, and the quality of the light from the high window has shifted from pale silver to a warmer, yellower tone, suggesting that the sun has risen fully above the curtain wall. You lift your gaze from the bird and let it travel once more around the familiar interior of the mews, as if to reassure yourself that the inspection has not disturbed the essential stillness of the place. Everything remains as it was. The empty perches, the neat work table, the brazier with its quiet embers, the sack of fresh sand, the waiting scale. And yet the room feels subtly different now, charged with the focused attention you have just given to the living creature on your hand. The goshawk herself seems unchanged, still watching you with her unreadable orange eyes, still breathing in that barely perceptible rhythm, but you sense that a kind of understanding has passed between you, a silent agreement that the day's first act is now complete, and that the next acts, the weighing, the journey to the larder, the feeding, can proceed in their own slow, orderly fashion. You take a moment to rub your thumb gently across the bird's breast feathers one more time, a gesture of both affection and practical assessment, feeling the plump firmness of her pectoral muscles and the slight hard keel of her breastbone beneath. The condition is exactly what you want, neither too fat nor too lean, a body that holds enough reserves for warmth and energy but remains keen and responsive. Satisfied, you move back toward the weighing scale, which still hangs from its beam with the padded perch attached to the tray, the needle pointing to 0. The goshawk, as if sensing the shift in purpose, adjusts her feet on your glove and fluffs her feathers briefly before settling again. In a few moments you will transfer her to the scale and begin the slow, precise process of recording her morning weight, another small measure in the long, quiet day of a falconer's apprentice waiting for a baron who may never return, while the autumn of 119.5 rolls gently onward outside the mews door. With the inspection complete and the Goshawk still balanced on your left fist in a state of calm alertness, you turn your full attention to the brass weighing scale suspended from the oak beam. The scale is an instrument of antique simplicity, a central balance arm of polished brass, a hanging tray suspended by 3 fine chains, and a set of graduated counterweights that slide along a notched rod. You have already placed the padded weighing perch onto the tray, a broad felt-covered crossbar that mirrors the bird's regular block, and you have adjusted the small lead counterpoise so that the empty tray hangs in perfect equilibrium, the needle pointing to the 0 mark etched into the brass faceplate. That was the preliminary act, a quiet calibration performed in the dimness before the inspection. Now it is time to add the living weight of the bird and discover what the night has done to her body's reserves. You approach the scale with a slow, rolling gait that keeps your upper body level, your gloved hands steady, your gaze fixed on the bird to observe any sign of restlessness. The goshawk, for her part, remains utterly composed, her feathers lying flat, her orange eyes following the movement of the candle flame rather than the shifting background of the room. You stop within reach of the scale, positioning yourself so that the tray hangs roughly at the height of your waist, the padded perch directly in front of the bird, and only a short step away. The 3 chains that hold the tray are fine linked and catch the candlelight in tiny glints, and the whole apparatus makes no sound except a faint metallic creak when you breathe near it, a sound so delicate it is more like a suggestion of a noise than a noise itself. Before you transfer the bird, you pause to review the sequence of movements that will keep the transfer smooth and the bird undisturbed. The jesses, those 2 short strips of leather that dangle from her legs, must be held lightly between your right thumb and forefinger to prevent her from baiting, but not so tightly that she feels restrained. The transition from glove to weighing perch must be a single unbroken arc, her body moving from one support to another without any intermediate gap of air that might alarm her. And the moment her feet touch the padded crossbar, you must freeze into absolute stillness, because the scale is sensitive enough to record the smallest tremor, and it will take time for the needle to settle to its true reading. You run through these thoughts without urgency, letting each one pass through your mind like a slow, clear current of water, and then you begin. You bring your right hand across your body and pinch the ends of the jesses between the pads of your thumb and finger, feeling the soft, familiar grain of the leather and the cool brass of the swivel that joins them to the leash ring. The bird feels the tension on her legs and shifts her weight slightly, tightening her grip on your glove for just a moment before relaxing again. You then lower your fist very gently, angling it so that the back of your hand faces upward and the bird's breast comes into contact with the padded crossbar of the weighing perch. She leans forward, her head dipping, her tail lifting to counterbalance the new posture, and in one seamless motion she releases her grip on your glove and steps onto the weighing perch, her talons finding the felt padding and clenching around it with the same automatic firmness they had used on your hand. You withdraw the glove slowly, still holding the jesses in a loose loop, and you straighten up so that you are standing beside the scale rather than in front of it, your body casting no shadow across the brass beam. For the first few seconds after the transfer, the scale responds with a wide, swooping oscillation, the needle swinging from left to right in arcs that gradually shorten as the initial disturbance dissipates. The tray dips and rises, the chains tinkling against one another in a tiny musical randomness, and the bird herself contributes to the movement by shifting her feet a little wider apart and adjusting her wings so that they lie snug against her flanks. You watch the needle with a detached, patient attention, waiting for the larger arcs to give way to smaller ones, which in turn will degrade into a slow, barely perceptible tremor. The whole process is one of gradual decay, the kinetic energy of the transfer bleeding out into the brass, the chains, the wooden beam, and the heavy, still air of the mews, until nothing remains but the faintest quiver. And then even that will stop. During this interval of settling, you occupy yourself by observing the way the goshawk stands on the weighing perch. Her posture is slightly different here than on her block, because the perch is narrower and the felt is newer and less compressed. She grips it with both feet, her toes wrapping entirely around the crossbar, and she holds her body more upright, her breast pushed forward, her tail angled downward at a steeper pitch. Her head swivels left and right in small incremental movements as she examines the scale apparatus, the chains, and the brass beam above her, objects she sees every morning but still regards with a flicker of wariness. You let her examine everything, keeping the jesses so slack that she could almost believe she is unheld, and you breathe slowly, exhaling through your nose because even the puff of a breath could sway the delicate balance. The light from the high window has continued its slow evolution while you work, shifting from the pale silver of earliest dawn to a buttery morning gold that now falls in a broad, slanted sheet across the eastern half of the mews. The beam of the scale catches this light and scatters it in tiny, bright reflections that dance across the stone wall opposite, a constellation of shifting specks that moves in rhythm with the decaying oscillation of the needle. You watch the reflections without thinking about them, your mind reduced to a single simple task: hold the jesses, stand still, wait. The castle beyond the walls has woken fully now, producing a low, continuous backdrop of sound that includes the distant thumping of the bakers kneading dough, the clank of the blacksmith's hammer beginning its morning's work, and the occasional call of a servant crossing the bailey. But all of it arrives here, in the mews, filtered and softened, translated into a quiet hum that barely rises above the level of your own pulse. After a considerable span of minutes, which you do not count because the mews contains no hourglass or water clock, the scale needle finally settles into a narrow, rhythmic sway that is more a vibration than a swing, its tip tracing a tiny arc of perhaps 1/4 of an inch. This is the point at which you can begin to read the weight, not as a single fixed number, but as a range, an average of the needle's ceaseless, tiny jitters. You lean forward slightly, keeping your back straight and your hand holding the jesses absolutely immobile, and you study the engraved markings on the scale's faceplate. The plate is a strip of polished brass, slightly tarnished at the edges, marked with a series of fine lines and numbers that run from 0 to 4 pounds in increments of 1/4 ounce. A sliding counterweight, a small brass rider shaped like a bean, sits at the 2-pound notch, and a second, finer adjustment weight hangs from a threaded rod at the end of the balance arm. You read the needle's position relative to the scale by noting the point at which it spends the most time, the resting center of its tiny, shivering dance. The reading, when you finally settle upon it, is 2 pounds and 9 ounces, just slightly below the 2 pounds and 11 ounces you recorded in your memory yesterday morning. The difference is small, no more than the weight of a hen's egg, but it is meaningful within the strict, narrow margins that govern a hunting hawk's condition. The bird has dropped 2 ounces overnight, most of it in the form of the casting she produced, the rest in the water she evaporated from her breath, and the energy her body consumed simply to stay warm while she slept. You hold this number in your mind, turning it over with the same gentle, patient attention you would give to a smooth pebble picked up from a stream bed, and you compare it to the other numbers you remember from the days before. 2 pounds 12 ounces 3 days ago, 2 pounds 11 yesterday, 2 pounds 11 yesterday, 2 pounds 9 today. The trend is a slow, steady decline, perfectly normal for a bird whose master is not hunting her and whose rations consist of a single measured meal per day. If the weight dropped below 2 pounds 7, you would consider increasing her food. If it rose above 2 pounds 13, you would reduce it. At 2 pounds 9, she is exactly where she should be, keen but not sharp-set, calm but not dull. You have now been standing beside the scale for a period of time that might have been 10 minutes or might have been half an hour, and your legs have grown slightly stiff from the stillness. You shift your weight very carefully, transferring it from one foot to the other without pulling on the jesses or causing the scale tray to sway, and you feel the small muscles in your lower back complain softly and then subside. The goshawk, having grown thoroughly bored with the scale, has begun to preen again, drawing one of her primary feathers through her beak in a single, long stroke that lasts several seconds, then moving on to a covert feather at her shoulder, then bending her head all the way back to attend to the feathers at the base of her tail. You let her preen, knowing that a bird who preens in this situation is a bird who is entirely at ease, and you take the opportunity to study the exact configuration of the scale's mechanism, the way the polished fulcrum catches the light, the way the brass beam is stamped with the mark of the instrument. Make her a tiny, worn fleur de lisande, the way the 3 support chains attach to the tray with delicate, hand-forged hooks. The weighing is essentially complete now, the number secured in your memory, but you do not rush to lift the bird off the perch. Instead, you give her several more minutes of stationary quiet, minutes in which she finishes her preening and settles back into a resting posture, with one foot lifted and tucked into her breast feathers, exactly as she had stood on her block. This is a final confirmation of her calm state. A nervous bird would keep both feet planted and her wings slightly lifted, ready to fly. She looks at you with her deep orange eyes, the pupils narrowed to pinpricks in the brightening light, and you feel the same quiet, wordless connection that occurs every morning when the weighing is done, and the small, vital piece of information has been transferred from the brass scale to your keeper's mind. There is no triumph in it, no relief, just a calm, steady satisfaction that another part of the day's ritual has been completed without any deviation from the expected. Now you bring your gloved left hand into position, approaching the bird from in front and below, just as you did at her block, and you press the back of the glove gently against her breast feathers. She looks at the glove, recognizes the gesture, and unfolds the foot she had tucked up, placing it back on the perch so that she is standing on both feet. You release the jesses from your right hand so that they hang freely, and then you push the glove slightly forward, encouraging her to step up. She does so with a single, smooth movement, her weight settling back onto your fist with a firm, reassuring heaviness that feels different from the light, suspended quality of the scale tray. You withdraw your hand from the weighing perch, and the scale, suddenly unburdened, swings upward and then oscillates in a wider arc than before, the needle sweeping from side to side as if surprised by the absence of the bird. It will take several minutes to settle back to 0, but you do not need to wait for that. You already have the reading. With the goshawk once again on your fist, you take a single step backward and observe the scale as it continues its slow, decaying oscillation. The chains still chiming softly, the beam rocking on its fulcrum. The apparatus, now empty, looks somehow incomplete, its purpose temporarily drained, and you feel a small, private sense of completion that is as quiet and unremarkable as the closing of a door. You carry the bird back toward her block, your footsteps making a soft, shushing sound in the straw, and you pause once more before the perch to see if she wants to return to it, or to remain on your glove for a while longer. She makes the decision for you by leaning forward and opening her wings just slightly, indicating her preference, and you lower your hand so that she can step off onto the block with the same smooth, deliberate motion she has displayed all morning. She settles instantly, her feet gripping the familiar, much-worn felt of the block perch, her talons finding the exact same indentations they have formed over many weeks of standing. You watch her standing there for a moment, observing every tiny shift in her posture that follows the transfer. First, she gives a small, full-body shake, a vibration that begins at her head and travels down through her wings, her body and her tail, ruffling every feather, and then laying them all flat again in a single instantaneous realignment. Second, she lowers her head and runs the tip of her beak along the edge of one wing, a cursory preen that seems more like a habit than a necessity. Third, she tucks one foot up into her breast feathers, the other foot holding her upright with effortless balance, and she half closes her eyes so that only a thin crescent of orange remains visible beneath the dark lids. By the time she has settled into this familiar one-footed rest pose, she looks exactly as she did when you first entered the mews this morning. A still, sculpted figure of feather and patience, unchanged by the inspection and the weighing, except in the tiniest of details. A feather slightly out of place, now put right. A muscle slightly warmed by the exercise of stepping up and stepping off. A mind slightly more accustomed to your presence than it was an hour ago. You stand beside the block for a moment longer, not because there is anything more to do, but because the peacefulness of the bird in her resting state is a thing worth witnessing. The weight he recorded, 2 pounds and 9 ounces, sits in your memory like a small, smooth stone, and you know that this evening you will repeat the whole process and find another number, perhaps the same, perhaps slightly different, and that tomorrow you will do it again, and the day after that, and the day after that, and the day after that, for as long as the Baron remains away on crusade and the autumn of 119.5 continues its slow turn toward winter. None of this troubles you. On the contrary, the predictability of it, the quiet, unwavering sameness of each day's tasks, is the very thing that allows your mind to rest so deeply in the present moment, free of any care for the past or the future. You turn away from the perch, leaving the goshawk to her half-sleep doze, and you walk back to the work table where the candle still burns with a steady, tall flame, and the leather gauntlet on your hand is beginning to feel warm and slightly damp from the bird's body heat. You pour a small splash of water from the clay jug into a shallow dish and dip your fingers in it, wiping the glove clean of any tiny feather fragments or scale polish that might have transferred during the handling, and you dry your fingers on the linen cloth that hangs from a peg by the table. Then you tip a little wax from the candle holder into the brazier to keep the embers fed, and you stand for a while looking out through the high barred window at the square of pale blue sky that shows above the curtain wall. The sky is empty of clouds, empty of birds, just a flat, depthless expanse of color that holds no particular meaning except that it signals a mild, dry autumn day ahead. A day perfectly suited to the quiet indoor labor of a falconer's apprentice whose only remaining tasks are the journey to the larder, the preparation of the morning meal, and the long, patient feeding that will occupy the middle hours of the morning. With the weighing complete and the goshawk returned to her block perch where she now dozes with one foot tucked into her breast feathers, you turn your attention to the next task that the slow morning requires. The bird will need her single daily meal, a ration of fresh meat prepared from whatever the castle larder holds, and it is time for you to walk across the bailey to select it. You lift the covered basket from its place by the door, a simple, sturdy vessel woven from split willow with a flat wooden lid and a leather strap for carrying. The basket is empty, its interior smelling faintly of the dried lavender you keep in a small linen sachet at the bottom, and it weighs almost nothing in your hand. You check that the lid fits snugly, then pull the leather glove from your left hand and lay it across the work table, flexing your bare fingers in the cooler air of the mews. The goshawk will be content on her block for the span of time this errand requires, and you have no reason to hurry. Before you leave, you pause by the brazier and add a single split log to the embers, placing it carefully so that it will catch slowly and burn for the better part of an hour while you are gone. The log is dry birch, its bark peeling in thin, papery curls, and it settles into the iron basket with a soft, ashy sigh. Then you lift the iron candle snuffer from its hook and press it gently over the flame of the tallow candle, extinguishing it with a small curl of smoke that rises straight upward and vanishes into the shadowed rafters. The mews will be dim again when you return, but the brazier will still glow, and you will relight the candle then. These small, methodical precautions are part of the rhythm that holds your days together, a series of tiny acts performed in the same order every morning, and you take a quiet comfort in their familiarity. You pick up the basket by its leather strap and move toward the door, passing the row of empty perches and the stack of fresh straw bales, your footsteps making a soft shushing sound in the river sand. At the door you lift the iron latch, which is cold and slightly damp to the touch, and you pull the heavy oak panel inward just far enough to slip through. The hinges groan once, a low, woody sound that carries no farther than the threshold, and then you are outside in the bailey again, pulling the door close behind you with a gentle, careful movement that produces only the softest of thuds. The morning has advanced while you are inside the mews, and the castle bailey now presents a different face than the one you crossed in the grey half-light of earliest dawn. The mist has burned away entirely, leaving the cobbles dry and pale, and the sun has risen high enough above the eastern curtain wall to flood the entire courtyard with a clean golden light. Shadows fall in sharp blue-grey angles from the wellhead, the bakery chimney, and the guardhouse tower, and the air feels warmer than before, though still cool enough to raise a faint, pleasant sting on your cheeks. The sky overhead is the same flat, depthless blue you observed through the mews window, unmarked by any cloud, and a few small brown sparrows flit between the eaves of the great hall, their chirping a bright, scattered music that rises and falls without pattern. You begin your walk across the bailey, following a route so familiar that your feet trace it without any conscious direction. The cobbles under your boots are worn smooth in the center of the path from centuries of passing feet, and they slope gently downward toward the undercroft entrance on the far side of the courtyard. You pass the stone wellhead, its wooden cover drawn closed and its iron windlass glinting with tiny beads of moisture, and you hear from deep below the faint, musical drip of water falling onto water. Beside the well, a single wooden bucket stands upturned on a stone block, its staves bleached grey by sun and rain. You step around it and continue past the kitchen garden, where the rows of cabbages you noticed in the mist now look brighter and greener, their broad outer leaves unfurling toward the sun. A few late bees move slowly among the gone-to-seed fennel stalks at the garden's edge. They're humming a low, intermittent drone that blends with the other morning sounds. The great hall looms on your left as you walk, its high, narrow windows dark and empty, its massive oak doors still closed. Inside, the servants will be laying the trestle tables for the midday meal that the household will take in the Baron's absence. But the hall itself gives no sign of this activity. It stands silent and imposing, its stones the colour of old honey in the morning light. Beyond the hall, the chapel door is open a crack, and you catch a brief, faint scent of incense and beeswax candles drifting out, a smell that always reminds you of feast days and long murmured Latin prayers. You do not stop because your errand is to the larder and the larder alone. But you note these details in the same detached, unhurried way you note the position of the sun and the direction of the breeze. The blacksmith's hammer, which you heard as a distant, muffled tapping while you worked in the mews, grows louder as you approach the far side of the bailey. The smithy stands against the outer wall, a low, open-fronted building with a smoking chimney and a great leather bellows that sighs and creaks with every pull. The smith himself, a broad-shouldered man in a scorched leather apron, is busy at his anvil, shaping what looks like a hinge strap, and the rhythmic clanging of his hammer on hot iron rings out across the cobbles with a steady, unhurried beat. He does not look up as you pass, his attention fixed entirely on the glowing metal before him, and you do not call out to him, because speech is not necessary between two people who see each other every day in the same quiet, predictable way. A few yards beyond the smithy, the guard at the gatehouse has woken fully now and stands at attention with his pike, though his eyes still have the distant, unfocused look of a man whose thoughts are elsewhere. You reach the entrance to the undercroft, a low, arched doorway set into the base of the keep's western wall, and approached by a short flight of worn stone steps leading downward. The door is made of thick, iron-banded oak, like the mews door, but it is heavier and older, its surface darkened by damp and time. A single iron sconce beside the doorway holds a rushlight that burns with a small, steady flame, its smoke staining the stone above in a long, black smear. You lift the latch, which is heavier than the one in the mews and requires a firmer grip, and you push the door inward, stepping from the bright morning of the bailey into the cool, constant twilight of the castle larder. The transition from light to shadow is a sudden, enveloping change that makes you pause on the threshold for a moment while your eyes adjust. The air inside the undercroft is markedly different from the air outside, cooler by several degrees, still and heavy, carrying a complex blend of scents that includes raw meat, dried herbs, old wood smoke, damp stone, and the faint, clean sharpness of salt. The ceiling is low and vaulted, the stone ribs springing from squat pillars that march in 2 rows down the length of the chamber, and the floor underfoot is paved with broad, uneven flagstones that have been worn into shallow concavities by generations of cellarers and cooks. A few narrow ventilation slits, set high in the walls, admit thin blades of daylight that slice diagonally through the dimness and fall upon the flagstones in pale, elongated rectangles. You step fully inside and close the door behind you, and the sounds of the bailey the blacksmith's hammer, the sparrows, the distant voices, are cut off as cleanly as if a heavy curtain had been drawn across them. In their place, the larder offers its own, quieter sounds, a faint, steady dripping from somewhere in the far corner where the stonework meets the foundation, the creak of a hanging hook as it sways almost imperceptibly, and the tiny, scurrying scratch of a mouse somewhere in the straw that covers the root stores. You take a deep breath, letting your lungs grow used to the cool, thick air, and you set the covered basket on the flagstones beside the door while you survey the provisions. The larder is arranged with the orderly precision that the Baron's steward demands, every item hanging from its own iron hook or resting on its own stone shelf. To your immediate left, A row of salted fish herrings mostly hang from a wooden rack, their silver skins dulled by the preservative salt and their heads removed. Beside them, a whole side of bacon wrapped in muslin cloth dangles from a heavy chain, its fat the color of old ivory. Farther along the wall, strings of dried onions and plaited garlic sway gently in the faint, almost imperceptible current of air that moves through the chamber, and below them, earthenware crocks sealed with wax hold butter, soft cheese, and pickled cabbage. A large barrel of ale sits in the corner, its wooden tap fitted with a pewter spigot, and beside it, a smaller cask of vinegar gives off a sharp, fruity smell that cuts through the heavier sense of meat and fish. Your destination, however, is the far end of the undercroft, where the fresh game hangs from a series of blackened iron hooks screwed into the ceiling beams. You walk between the squat pillars, your footsteps echoing with a hollow, ringing quality that is peculiar to the vaulted stone space, and you pass the salt bin, a great wooden chest, half filled with coarse, grey-white salt that glitters like tiny crystals in the dim light. A large earthenware bowl of hen's eggs sits on a shelf beside the salt bin, each egg a pale, warm brown, and a basket of apples, their skins wrinkled, but their flesh still firm, rests on the flagstones nearby. All of these provisions, the fish, the bacon, the onions, the cheese, and the crocks of pickled cabbage, will feed the household through the autumn and into the winter. But the game birds on their hooks are what concern you now. You reach the hanging game and pause to inspect what is available. The hooks hold a varied offering: 2 brace of partridges, their barred brown plumage still bright and their heads lolling; a single plump wood pigeon, its breast a deep, soft grey; 3 rabbits, skinned and cleaned, their flesh pale pink and their legs trussed with twine; and a single hare, larger than the rabbits, hung by its hind legs with a small bowl beneath it to catch any drips. All of this was brought in by the huntsman yesterday, delivered to the larder in the late afternoon while you were weighing the goshawk for her evening reading, and all of it is fresh, cooled by the constant temperature of the undercroft, and untouched by any decay. A faint metallic tang of blood hangs around the game hooks, but the smell is clean and not unpleasant, the smell of good meat properly stored. You consider the choices before you, with the same slow, methodical attention you bring to every task. The goshawk requires a single bird for her daily meal, something with enough flesh to sustain her, but not so much that she becomes heavy and dull. The partridges are well-sized, their breasts plump and rounded, but the wood pigeon, hanging slightly apart from the others on its own hook, catches your eye. Its body is intact, the feathers clean and unbroken, the weight of it substantial in a way that suggests a rich, dark meat. The pigeon was probably taken from the Dover coati rather than shot, because its flesh shows no bruising or pellet damage, and this makes it a clean, simple choice for the bird's dinner. You reach up and lift the pigeon from its hook, cradling it in both hands to feel its weight and its cool, pliant flesh. The body is still slightly warm at the core, a residual heat that has not yet fully leached away into the cold stone of the undercroft, and the feathers are silky and smooth against your palms. Satisfied with your selection, you carry the pigeon back toward the door where your basket waits. On the way, you stop at a small shelf near the salt bin where a pile of clean linen cloths, roughly hemmed squares of undyed flax, are kept for wrapping meat. You take one, shake it open, and lay it flat on the flagstones beside the basket. Then place the pigeon in the center of the cloth and fold the corners over it with neat, precise movements, tucking the last corner under so that the bundle will not come undone during the walk back. You lift the wrapped pigeon and place it into the basket, settling it gently in the bottom, and then you fit the lid over the top and press it down until it sits securely. The basket, which was empty and light when you arrived, now has a small, satisfying heft, a weight that pulls gently on your arm as you lift it by the strap. Before leaving the larder, you take a moment to look around the dim, vaulted chamber one more time, ensuring that you have left everything as you found it. The hook where the pigeon hung is now empty, a small bare space among the other hooks, but the steward will note the absence and adjust his tally stick accordingly, and the huntsman will replenish the stock on his next round. Nothing is out of place, the barrel of ale sits in its corner, the strings of onions sway in their patient arc, the drip in the far corner continues its slow, steady rhythm. You turn to the heavy iron-banded door, lift the latch, and push outward, feeling the door swing open with more ease now that you are pushing from inside, and you step up the worn stone stairs and back into the bright golden morning of the Bailey. The sunlight strikes your face with a sudden pleasant warmth after the cool dimness of the undercroft, and you squint against the glare for a few seconds while your eyes readjust. The Bailey has grown slightly busier in your absence. A servant woman crosses from the kitchen to the well, with 2 empty buckets swinging from a yoke across her shoulders, and a stable boy leads a tall, sleepy-looking horse across the cobbles toward the water trough near the gatehouse. The blacksmith's hammer continues its steady, rhythmic beat, and the sparrows still flit among the eaves, but there is a sense now of the castle properly awake, its daily life unfurling in the same slow, predictable patterns that govern your own work. You nod briefly to the servant woman as she passes, receiving a small, tired smile in return, and then you begin the walk back toward the mews, the basket with its wrapped pigeon swinging gently against your leg. You retrace your earlier route, passing the smithy, the chapel, and the great hall, and you notice small changes that have occurred while you were underground. The well cover has been drawn open now, and the bucket you saw upturned has been lowered into the shaft. A tray of unbaked loaves, covered with a damp cloth, sits on the sill of the bakery window, and the guard at the gatehouse has been replaced by a different man, still sleepy and leaning on his pike. These small shifts in the texture of the morning are as much a part of your routine as the weighing and the inspecting. A slow, gentle turnover of the castle's ordinary life that you witness without participating in. The air smells of wood smoke and fresh bread now, and the sun has climbed a little higher, shortening the shadows and warming the cobbles so that you can feel the heat radiating upward through the soles of your boots. You reach the mews door, the long, low building of grey stone and dark thatch looking exactly as you left it, the high window still showing its square of pale blue sky, the iron ring of the door handle still cool to the touch. You lift the latch, pull the door open, and step inside, closing it behind you with the same careful, muffled thud. The interior of the mews welcomes you back with its familiar blend of heather, old wood, straw, and warm feathers, and the glow of the brazier shows that the birch log you added is caught properly, its bark curling and blackening at the edges while a small, steady flame licks along its underside. The goshawk remains on her block, still dozing with one foot tucked up, still unchanged in any visible way since you left. You set the basket on the work table, remove the lid, and lift out the linen-wrapped bundle, placing it beside the cutting board and the small, sharp knife that waits there. Then you stand for a moment in the quiet, feeling the stillness of the mews settle around you like a familiar, comfortable garment, and you prepare yourself for the long, patient work of dressing the pigeon and preparing the morsels that will become the goshawk's morning meal, a task that will occupy the next unhurried chapter of this slow, ordinary day in the autumn of 115.5. You lift the linen-wrapped bundle from the basket and set it on the scarred wooden work table, the cloth cool and slightly damp against your fingers from its time in the undercroft. A fresh candle now burns in the iron holder beside you, its flame tall and steady after being relit from the brazier's embers, and the window's square of pale sky has brightened to a pale, even silver, casting a diffuse light that falls across the table without strong shadows. Everything you need for the long, quiet task of preparing the bird's single daily meal is already arranged within easy reach, the small, sharp knife with its bone handle worn smooth by use. A shallow earthenware dish blazed on the inside with a thin, crackled coating, a clay jug of cool water, a folded linen drying cloth, and a few stems of dried lavender in a small pottery cup that scents the air with a faint, dusty sweetness whenever your sleeve brushes past it. You pull the three-legged stool closer to the table and sit down, feeling the solid, familiar seat beneath you, and the slight give of the straw on the floor under your feet. The position brings your eyes level with the work surface, and from here you can see the goshawk across the mews, still perched on her block in her one-footed doze, her body motionless except for the barely perceptible lift and fall of her breathing. The mews is deeply quiet now, quieter even than before because the morning sounds from the Bailey have settled into a steady, distant hum that no longer registers as separate noises. The candle flame points straight upward without wavering, and the earthy, smoky scent of the birch log burning in the brazier has begun to overtake the cooler smell of damp stone that clung to you from the larder. All the conditions are exactly right for the unhurried work ahead, and you settle into them the way you might settle into a warm bath, letting the stillness soak into your limbs. You begin by untying the knotted corner of the linen cloth, working the fabric loose with careful fingers so that it unfolds in gentle stages. The cloth opens like the petals of a pale flower, and there in its center lies the wood pigeon, a compact, rounded form of soft grey feathers and still, closed eyes. The bird's head lolls to one side, the delicate, dark-tipped beak slightly parted, and the feet, a deep coral pink, are curled inward in the relaxed posture of death. In the candlelight, the iridescent patches on the pigeon's neck shimmer with hints of green and purple, catching the flame and throwing it back in tiny shifting glints. You lay the cloth flat and run a single fingertip over the smooth curve of the breast, feeling the residual coolness of the larder, and, beneath it, the plump resilience of the meat that will soon feed the goshawk. The flesh yields, slightly under pressure, and then springs back, a sign that the bird is fresh and of good quality. The plucking, which must be done before you can reach the meat, is a task you approach with the same patience, repetitive care you give to every other part of the routine. You take a small splint basket from under the table, weaving it between your feet so that it sits ready to catch the feathers, and you lift the pigeon gently in your left hand, cradling it belly up. The feathers are densest on the breast and belly, and this is where you begin, pinching a few at a time between your thumb and the edge of the knife blade and pulling them out with short, firm tugs that release the quills from the skin with a faint, dry, rustling sound. Each feather comes away cleanly, leaving behind a patch of pale, slightly dimpled skin, and you drop the feathers into the basket, where they accumulate in a loose grey heap that shifts and settles with every addition. You work systematically, moving from the breast outward to the wings and then down to the legs, turning the bird in your hand as needed, and you feel the warmth of your own fingers gradually transferring into the cooling flesh. The wing feathers are larger and stiffer than the breast down, their quills set more deeply into the skin, and these require a stronger pull and a slight twisting motion to release. You remove the primary flight feathers one by one, laying them aside on the cloth because they are too long and stiff for the scrap basket and will be burned later in the brazier. After the primaries come the coverts, smaller and softer, and then the fine dusty feathers of the underwing, which come away in tiny tufts that stick to your damp fingers. You pause now and then to wipe your hand on the linen cloth and to observe the bird's changing appearance as the grey plumage yields to the bare, unadorned skin beneath. The pigeon, once sleek and feathered, now looks surprisingly small and naked, its body a landscape of pale goose-pimpled flesh with a faint bluish undertone where the dark meat lies closest to the surface. The head still bears its small neat cap of blue-grey feathers, and the tail remains intact, but the body is nearly bare, ready for the next stage of preparation. With the plucking complete, you set the spent feathers aside and take up the small, sharp knife, testing its edge against the pad of your thumb in a gesture so habitual that you perform it without conscious thought. The blade is keen enough, but you give it a few light strokes across the small whetstone that lives at the back of the work table, a rhythmic, whispering rasp of metal on stone that lasts only a moment and then subsides. You clean the blade with a splash of water from the jug and dries on the linen cloth, and then you turn your attention to the pigeon's body, which now lies on a fresh, clean square of cloth spread over the cutting board. The next step is to open the body and remove the entrails, separating the choice meat that the goshawk will eat from the organs and viscera that you will set aside for other purposes or discard. You make the first incision just below the keel of the breastbone, pressing the point of the knife through the skin with a gentle, precise pressure and drawing it downward in a single, straight line that opens the belly cavity. The skin parts cleanly, revealing the delicate translucent membrane beneath, and, through it, the dark shapes of the internal organs. You set the knife down and use the tips of your fingers to tease the opening wider, feeling the slight warmth of the body's interior, a residual heat that has outlasted the cold of the undercroft. The smell that rises from the open cavity is faint and clean, a mild, iron-tined scent of fresh meat that carries no hint of spoilage. You work the opening carefully, separating the skin from the underlying tissue with your thumb until the entire breastbone is exposed, a pale, curved shield of cartilage that glistens in the candlelight. Now you use the knife again, this time to cut through the thin connections that hold the entrails in place, working slowly around the liver, the heart, the gizzard, and the long coils of the intestine. You lift each organ out with your fingers or the flat of the blade, examining them briefly as you go. The liver is a deep, glossy reddish-brown, its surface smooth and unblemished. You set it aside on a small corner of the cloth, because the goshawk will eat it with particular relish. The heart, small and dark and shaped like a tiny purse, goes beside the liver, another favoured morsel that you will save for the end of the feeding. The gizzard, a firm muscular sac, you slit open with a single quick cut to empty its contents of small seeds and grit, and then you add it to the pile of usable meat. The intestines and other soft organs you place in a separate pile, destined for the scrap bucket that will be carried to the midden later in the day. Throughout this slow, careful dissection, your hands move with the automatic precision of long experience, and your mind drifts in a calm, unfocused state that requires no deliberate thought. When the body cavity is empty and clean, you rinse the whole carcass in the basin of cool water, holding it under the surface and swishing it gently to remove any traces of blood or loose tissue. The water clouds faintly pink, and you pour it out into the scrap bucket, refilling the basin from the clay jug for a second, final rinse. Then you pat the pigeon dry with the linen cloth, blotting the skin until it is merely damp, and you lay it on the cutting board with the breast facing upward, ready for the transformation into individual morsels. The cutting of the meat is the most time-consuming part of the preparation, and you settle into it with the patience of someone who has no other obligations in the world. You begin by removing the breast meat, the two large plump fillets that lie on either side of the breastbone. Holding the bird steady with your left hand, you slide the knife along the edge of the keel, feeling the blade follow the contour of the bone as it separates the flesh, and you pare the meat away in a single smooth piece, laying it on the cutting board. The breast fillet is firm and dense, its color a deep, dark claret that is almost purple in the candlelight, and it yields slightly to the touch like a ripe plum. You repeat the process on the other side, removing the second fillet, and then you turn your attention to the legs and thighs, cutting them free at the joints with small, precise movements of the knife tip. With the meat separated from the bone, you begin the slow work of cutting it into morsels, each one about the size of the tip of your thumb. This is a task that cannot be rushed, because the pieces must be uniform enough to pass easily down the goshawk's throat, but large enough to provide a satisfying mouthful. You hold each piece of meat with your fingertips, judge its size, and slice through it with a single clean draw of the knife, letting the morsels fall into the shallow earthenware dish. The dish gradually fills with a neat pile of dark, glistening cubes, their cut surfaces beaded with tiny droplets of juice that catch the candlelight. You pause now and then to wipe the knife on the cloth and to flex your fingers, which can grow stiff from the repetitive motion, and you listen to the small wet sounds of the blade passing through flesh, sounds so quiet they barely rise above the gentle hiss of the candle flame. Next you prepare the organs you set aside, the liver and the heart, which the goshawk values above all other parts of the meal. The liver is soft and fragile, and you cut it into smaller, flatter pieces with a delicate, soaring motion that avoids crushing the tissue. The heart, being tougher and more muscular, requires a firmer cut, and you slice it into 3 round medallions, each one revealing the tiny chambers within. These choice morsels you place on one side of the dish, slightly apart from the pile of breast meat, so that you will remember to offer them at the end of the feeding as a sort of reward. The gizzard, after being washed again, is cut into strips, and the meat from the thighs and legs is separated from the tendons and cut into pieces that match the breast morsels. By the time you have finished, the dish holds a tidy, orderly arrangement of dark red meat, and the cutting board is bare except for a few small smears of blood and juice that you wipe away with the cloth. The preparation of the morning ration is now essentially complete, but the ritual does not end with the last slice of the knife. There is a second, quieter part of the task that involves cleaning yourself and your tools, restoring the work table to its usual state of immaculate readiness. You carry the scrap bucket to the corner of the mews and tip the feathers, the bones, the unwanted entrails, and the rinse water into it, then cover it with its wooden lid to keep any odor from spreading. You wash the knife thoroughly in the basin, scrubbing the blade and the handle with a scrap of rough linen until no trace of meat remains, and then you dry it and return it to its leather sheath, which hangs from a peg on the wall. The cutting board you wipe down with a damp cloth, and the earthenware dish, now filled with the goshawk's meal, you cover with a clean square of linen to keep the meat fresh until the feeding begins. Your own hands, which have been in contact with the raw meat and the viscera, must be washed with particular care before you handle the bird again. You pour fresh water into the basin, the liquid clear and cold from the clay jug, and you immerse your hands to the wrists, rubbing them together with the same calm, methodical movements you use for every other task. You work a small piece of ash soap between your palms, the soap made from the castle's own wood ashes and tallow, and it produces a thin, grey lather that smells faintly of smoke and fat. You scrub your fingers, your nails, the spaces between your knuckles, and the backs of your hands, and then you rinse them in several changes of water until the last trace of soap is gone. You dry your hands on a fresh linen cloth, pressing the fabric around each finger, and you hold them up to the candlelight to check that no speck of blood or scale remains. The final act of the preparation is to pick up the dried lavender stems from their little pottery cup and roll them gently between your palms. The stems are brittle and woody, the dried flower heads crumbling slightly under the pressure, and they release a cloud of fragrance that is at once sweet, sharp, and deeply clean. You crush the lavender just enough to release the oils, and then you rub your fingers over your palms, the backs of your hands, and even the cuffs of your tunic sleeves, spreading the scent across your skin, so that when you approach the goshawk, she will smell nothing alarming, only the calm botanical familiarity of the herbs you use every day. The lavender scent mingles with the other smells of the mews, the warm feathers, the birch smoke, the clean straw, and together they form a single, harmonious atmosphere that fills the space and settles into your lungs with every slow breath you take. You stand for a moment beside the work table, the dish of prepared meat in your hand, and the lavender-scented warmth of your own skin rising to meet your nostrils, and you look across the mews at the goshawk. She's not moved perceptibly since you began the preparation, but her head is now turned slightly toward you, her orange eyes open and watching, as if she has become aware through some subtle shift in the air that the food is ready. Her posture is still relaxed, her foot still tucked, but there is a new quality of attention in her gaze, a quiet, patient expectation that needs no outward sign. You know that it is time to begin the feeding, the long, slow ritual that will occupy the next hour of the morning and that will fill the mews with a silence even deeper than the one that prevails now. A silence broken only by the sound of a beak taking meat from your fingers, a single soft chime of the bell, and the steady, unhurried rhythm of your own breathing. The dish of prepared meat rests in your right hand, its shallow earthenware curve filled with a neat pile of dark, glistening morsels. You have spent the last portion of the morning cutting and arranging. In your left hand, the leather gauntlet is once again pulled snug over your fingers, the glove's palm darkened from countless feedings, and its cuff turned down at your wrist. You cross the mews from the work table to the goshawk's block with the slow, even steps that have become second nature, and you see that she has emerged from her half-doze into a state of quiet, focused attention. Her foot that was tucked into her breast feathers is now planted on the padded perch, her head is lifted and turned toward you, and her orange eyes track the dish in your hand with an intensity that is entirely calm, entirely free of agitation. She knows what is coming, but she does not cry out or shift her weight. She simply waits. You set the dish on the stone ledge beside the perch, within easy reach but out of the bird's direct line of lunge, and you take a moment to adjust the position of your gloved hand relative to the block. The feeding will follow a strict, ancient pattern that you have learned through repetition and through the careful instruction of the old falconer who left with the baron. You will offer each morsel between your thumb and forefinger, holding it just below the level of her breast so that she must lean down to take it, a posture that encourages calmness and discourages any sudden, snatching movement. The pace will be slow, with long pauses between each morsel, pauses in which the bird will swallow, digest the sensation, and look around the mews or preen a feather before returning her attention to you. There are no bells to mark the passage of time during the feeding, no hourglass running, no sun clock ticking. There is only the rhythm of offer, acceptance, swallow, pause, a rhythm as old and unhurried as the tides. You present your gloved fist to the goshawk, pressing the back of your hand gently against her breast feathers as you did during the weighing, and she steps up without hesitation, her talons gripping the glove with a pressure that is fractionally firmer than before, a small, instinctive response to the presence of food. You lift her from the block and hold her at chest height, your elbow tucked against your side for stability, and you turn slightly so that the light from the high window falls across your left shoulder and illuminates the bird's head and your offering hand. The dish of meat waits on the ledge. You reach toward it with your right hand and pick up the first morsel, a single cube of the dark breast meat, cool but no longer chilled, its surface slightly sticky against your fingertips. The goshawk watches the morsel move, her pupils contracting and expanding in tiny, rapid adjustments, and she parts her beak just enough to show the tip of her grey, pointed tongue. You hold the morsel below her breast, as the method instructs, and she bends her head downward with a smooth, graceful motion, the curve of her neck compressing and then extending as she takes the meat from your fingers with the very tip of her beak. The touch is delicate, almost surgical, the sharp hook of the upper beak closing around the morsel without grazing your skin, and then she lifts her head to its upright position and tilts it back slightly to let the meat slide into her throat. You see the small, rippling motion of the swallow pass down the length of her neck, a wave of muscle that begins just under her beak and travels downward to disappear beneath the feathers of her breast. A single soft sound escapes her, a tiny click of the beak closing, and then she is still again, her eyes returning to the dish, her posture unchanged. You wait. This is the most important part of the feeding, the waiting, because a goshawk fed too quickly will become excited and difficult to handle, while a goshawk fed with generous pauses will remain calm and trusting. During the pause, you look at the bird's face, at the fine, dark edge of her beak, and the pale cera around her nostrils, and you observe the way her breathing has not quickened at all, the way her feathers remain flat and smooth. The mews is so silent that you can hear the faint, papery rustle of the birch log still burning in the brazier, and the distant, muffled sound of the castle's life continuing beyond the walls. You count your own slow breaths, letting 4 or 5 complete inhalations and exhalations pass before you reach for the second morsel. The second morsel you select is slightly smaller than the first, a piece from the thigh that contains a little more connective tissue and will give the bird something to work her beak against. You hold it out in the same position, below the breast, and she takes it with the same gentle precision, tilting her head to swallow and then watching you with her steady orange gaze. This time, after swallowing, she lowers her head and runs the tip of her beak along the edge of the glove, a small habitual gesture that you recognize as a form of cleaning, a wiping away of any stray juices or fragments. You wait again, shifting your weight slightly from one foot to the other to keep your legs from stiffening, and you let the silence stretch out around you, both like a deep, still pool. After the third morsel, which is a piece of the dark, soft liver, the goshawk pauses longer than usual, and she uses the interval to preen a chest feather that has become slightly ruffled. She draws the feather through her beak in a single, methodical stroke, then another, and then she turns her attention to the bend of her wing, where a tiny, pale feather sheath has worked loose and needs to be nibbled away. You stand motionless, the dish of meat at your side, and you let her preen without interruption, because you know that a bird who preens during a feeding is a bird who is entirely comfortable. The sound of her beak moving through her feathers is a tiny, regular ticking, like the slowest possible clock, and it adds another layer of texture to the mews's deep, layered silence. When she finishes preening and turns her attention back to you, you offer the fourth morsel, a piece of the gizzard that is firmer and more resistant than the breast meat. She takes it and works it in her beak for a moment, adjusting its position with small sideways movements of her head, and then she swallows it with a visible effort, the muscles of her throat contracting more strongly than before. After this, you decide to extend the pause a little longer, not because the bird needs it, but because the whole purpose of the morning feeding is to stretch time out like a length of soft, woven wool, to fill the hours with a single, calm, continuous action that has no urgency and no deadline. You let your gaze drift away from the bird and travel around the mews, over the empty perches, the weighing scale now still and silent, the stack of straw bales, the small barred window with its square of unchanging blue sky. The light has not shifted perceptibly since you began, and the candle flame still burns upright and steady, and the whole world seems to have paused, suspended in this one quiet ritual of meat and beak and breath. You offer the 5th morsel, the 6th, the 7th, each one accepted with the same delicate care, each one followed by a pause that seems to last longer than the one before. The pile of meat in the dish shrinks slowly, the morsels diminishing from a heap to a scattered layer, and you note the subtle change in the goshawk's posture as her crop begins to fill. A small soft bulge now appears at the base of her throat, just above the breastbone, a swelling that is entirely natural and that you monitor with quiet attention to ensure it does not become overfull. The crop is the bird's temporary storage pouch, where food waits before passing into the stomach, and a properly filled crop should be visible but not tight, rounded but not distended. You brush the back of your finger lightly against the bulge, feeling its firm, pliant texture through the feathers, and you judge that she can accept perhaps 5 or 6 more morsels before she has reached her ideal amount. The next morsel you offer is the 2nd piece of liver, and the goshawk takes it with a barely perceptible eagerness, her head moving toward your fingers a fraction faster than before. You note this small change in tempo and respond by slowing down even further, holding the pause after the swallow for a full minute or more, letting the bird's excitement subside back into calm patience. The feeding of a goshawk is as much an art of observation as of action, a constant, gentle negotiation between the bird's appetite and the keeper's sense of what is right, and you have learned over many months to read the tiny signals that indicate her state of mind. A slightly faster lean, a fractional tightening of the talons on the glove, a certain brightness in the eye. These are the signs that tell you to wait, to breathe, to let the stillness do its work. When the dish holds only a handful of morsels, you pause the feeding entirely and take a longer break. Not just a few breaths, but a full span of minutes. You walk slowly across the mews with the bird still on your fist, a short, circuitous route that takes you past the brazier, past the work table, past the row of empty perches, and then back to the block. The movement gives your legs a chance to stretch and the bird a chance to digest a little in a different context, her head swiveling to take in the familiar sights of the mews from a slightly altered perspective. The brazier's embers glow a deep, pulsing orange as you pass, and you feel the warmth of them against your cheek, a brief, pleasant sensation that vanishes as you turn away. The goshawk's weight on your glove has increased by the small amount of meat now stored in her crop, and your arm registers this difference as a slightly deeper ache in the shoulder, a familiar fatigue that you accept without complaint. You return to the block and decide not to place her back on it, preferring to finish the feeding with her still on the fist. The final morsels are the choicest ones, the 3 medallions of heart, dark and dense and rich with the flavor that hawks value above all else. You offer the first medallion, and the goshawk takes it with a distinct increase in attention, her beak closing around it with a soft, precise snap, her head tilting farther back to swallow. You wait a long, full pause, and then you offer the 2nd medallion, the last large piece in the dish. She takes it as she took the first, and now her crop is visibly fuller, a soft, rounded swelling that moves with her breathing. The 3rd medallion is smaller, a final, symbolic mouthful that marks the end of the meal. And when she takes it from your fingers and swallows it, you feel a quiet, internal sense of completion, as if a long, slow sentence has finally reached its full stop. After the last morsel, you do not immediately put the bird back on her block. Instead, you hold her on your fist for a long, settling interval, a span of time in which the two of you simply stand together in the quiet mews. The goshawk's breathing is even and deep, her crop a comfortable, warm bulge against the top of your glove, and her eyes have taken on a slightly drowsy quality, the lids beginning to droop toward the half-closed position that signals a full, contented hawk. She raises one foot and tucks it into her breast feathers, the same one-footed resting pose you have seen every morning, and she gives a small, contented shake of her whole body that ruffles her feathers and then settles them back into place with a soft, silky sound. The bell on her tail gives a single, muted chime, and then there is silence again. You walk to the block and lower your hand, and the goshawk steps off with a slow, heavy motion, her talons finding the familiar felt of the perch and her body settling into its usual position. She stands for a moment on both feet, her crop swaying slightly as she finds her balance, and then she tucks her foot back up and closes her eyes part way, slipping back into the doze from which she emerged at the start of the feeding. The dish in your hand is empty, its earthenware surface smeared with a faint dark residue of meat juices, and you carry it back to the work table where you will wash it later. For now you simply stand by the table, looking across the mews at the bird on her perch, and you feel the same quiet, unnameable satisfaction that comes every morning at this moment. The satisfaction of having done one thing slowly and well, of having asked nothing more of the day than this single, patient act of care. The feeding is finished, the earthenware dish rests empty on the work table, and the goshawk has returned to her block perch where she now stands in a drowsy, contented stillness, with her crop full and rounded, a soft bulge at the base of her throat that lifts slightly with each slow breath. You watch her for a while from the table, allowing the quiet to settle back into the mews after the long, intimate ritual of the feeding, and you observe the tiny, almost invisible movements that continue to play across her body now that her meal is complete. Her eyelids droop to half-mast and then open again, the inner lid sliding across the eye in a slow, milky sweep. Her beak opens a crack and closes, a motion that might be a yawn or an adjustment of the tongue. Her foot, which she had tucked up into her breast feathers, eases back down to the perch and then lifts again, as if she cannot quite decide on her preferred resting posture. These small, sleepy adjustments continue for several minutes, and you do not interrupt them, knowing that the bird needs this interval of stillness to begin the slow work of digestion. It is during this period of quiet observation that you notice the small fleck of undigested matter on the sand below her block, a tiny grey-white speck no larger than a lentil, which she has cast up at some point during the feeding or in the moments just after. The speck lies on the smooth surface of the sand like a single grain of coarse salt, and you know from experience that it is a fragment of bone or feather sheath that her stomach refused, a miniature casting that signals the conclusion of the previous night's digestion and the beginning of a new cycle. Its presence reminds you that the morning's chores are not yet complete, that the perch and the sand and the various implements of the mews must be tended before the afternoon's long doze can begin. You stretch your arms once, feeling the pleasant mild ache of having held the bird on your fist for the better part of an hour, and then you gather the tools you will need for the cleaning. The first tool is a flat piece of beechwood, a simple scraper about the length of your forearm with one edge beveled to a blunt, smooth blade. It has been warmed glassy by years of sliding across sand and stone, and its handle fits into your palm with the comfort of long familiarity. The second tool is a wooden bucket, broad and shallow, its staves darkened with age and its iron hoops speckled with rust. These two items live in the corner of the mews, beside the sack of fresh river sand, and you retrieve them quietly, carrying the bucket in one hand and the scraper in the other, as you walk back across the room. Your footsteps in the straw make the same soft, shushing sound they always make, and the goshawk registers your approach with a single, slow blink, but no other movement. You kneel down beside the block perch, feeling the straw cushion your knees through the coarse wool of your tunic, and you begin the careful work of scraping the sand. The area directly below the perch is marked with a few small depressions where the bird's talons have pressed into the sand, and scattered across the surface are the night's accumulations. The small, fresh casting, a few tiny feather fragments, a single dried splash of white moult, and the faint, powdery dust that all feathers shed as they age. You place the edge of the beechwood scraper against the sand and draw it toward you with slow, even pressure, peeling up a thin layer that curls and cracks and slides into the bucket. The sound of the scraper moving through sand is a dry, granular whisper, a sound that belongs entirely to the task and that fills your ears with its gentle, repetitive rhythm. You work the scraper in overlapping strokes, each one removing a little more of the soiled material, and you turn the bucket as you go so that the sand piles up evenly rather than mounding in one spot. Every few strokes, you pause and use the flat of the scraper to smooth the remaining sand, checking that you have removed all the discolored patches and any hidden fragments. The pale river sand underneath the top layer is cleaner and lighter, a soft bone-white color that contrasts with the slightly grayed surface you are removing. When you have scraped the entire area under the perch and a little beyond, you lift the bucket and tip the spent sand onto the scrap heap in the corner, a low mound that will be carried to the garden eventually to sweeten the soil, and you return to the perch to complete the next stage of the task. Now you go to the sack of fresh sand, which leans against the wall near the door, a coarse hempen sack that stands as high as your waist and is cinched at the top with a length of frayed rope. You loosen the knot, fall back the mouth of the sack, and scoop out the clean sand with your cupped hands, letting it sift through your fingers and cascade into the wooden bucket. The fresh sand is cool and dry, its grains rounded and uniform from centuries of tumbling in the riverbed, and it carries a faint, clean scent of water-washed stone and distant hills. You fill the bucket about halfway, enough to cover the area beneath the perch to a depth of 2 finger widths, and you carry it back to the block with both hands, feeling the pleasant, shifting weight pulling against your arms. You sprinkle the fresh sand in a slow, even layer, walking a half circle around the perch so that the distribution is uniform and no spot remains thin. The sand falls from your fingers in a steady, pale stream, and as it lands it forms a surface so smooth and undisturbed that it looks like the skin of a still pond at first light. When the bucket is empty, you set it aside and use the flat side of the beechwood scraper to level the new sand, drawing it lightly across the surface until every ripple and furrow vanishes. Now the area under the block is pristine, a pale empty canvas waiting for the next day's small ordinary signs of the goshawk's presence, and you feel a quiet satisfaction at the simple visual order you have restored. With the sand renewed, you turn your attention to the block perch itself, the broad, flat-topped piece of oak on which the goshawk spends most of her hours. She is still standing on it, still drowsy, her crop now slightly smaller than it was half an hour ago, as the food begins its slow journey from the crop into the stomach. You do not need to move her for this part of the tending, because she is calm and settled and will tolerate your hands near her feet and her perch. You approach slowly, letting her see you, and you run your bare palm over the exposed wood of the block's top surface, the part that extends beyond the padded felt and that she rarely touches. The oak is smooth and dense, its grain a pattern of fine, dark lines that swirl and loop back on themselves, and the wood has been polished by years of oiling and handling to a deep, honey-brown luster that glows faintly in the candlelight. You feel every inch of the top surface, pressing your fingertips into the grain and sliding them along the edges, searching for any splinters or cracks that might catch a talon or snag a feather. The block is in good condition, as it nearly always is, but you do find one small roughened patch near the back edge where the wood has begun to lift slightly, a tiny hair-thin flaw that would go unnoticed by anyone who was not looking for it. You take a square of fine sandcloth from the work table, a piece of linen coated with crushed pumice, and you rub it gently over the rough spot with small circular motions until the wood is once again smooth as skin. The dust from the sanding is fine and pale, and you blow it off with a single soft puff of breath, watching the particles scatter into the straw. Next you inspect the padded felt that covers the top of the block, the layer of dense grey-brown wool that provides a soft grit for the bird's feet. The felt is compressed into 2 shallow depressions where the goshawk habitually plants her talons, and the edges are slightly frayed from months of use, but the padding is still thick and resilient, and the leather binding that wraps around the block's rim is tight and unbroken. You press your thumb into the felt, testing its springiness, and you pluck away a few loose wool fibers that have worked free, rolling them into a tiny ball between your fingers and dropping it into the scrap bucket. The bell on the goshawk's tail gives a single sleepy chime as she shifts her weight from one foot to the other, and you glance at her face to see that her eyes are now more than half closed, her whole body settling deeper into the afternoon's approaching lethargy. The tending of the perch extends naturally downward to the jesses, the 2 short leather straps that hang from the goshawk's legs and that you handle every time you pick her up. You crouch beside the block, bringing your eyes level with the bird's feet, and you examine the jesses one at a time without touching them at first, noting the color and texture of the leather, the condition of the stitching, and the state of the small brass eyelets that connect them to the leash ring. The leather is a dark, rich brown, pliable and smooth, and it shows no cracks or stiffness despite its age. The stitching along the edges is intact, the waxed linen thread still holding firmly, and the eyelets are clean and free of verdigris. You reach out slowly and lift one of the jesses between your thumb and forefinger, feeling the soft, familiar grain of the leather, and you bend it gently back and forth to test its flexibility. It yields easily, and the bird does not react to the handling because the jesses are part of her everyday existence, no more alarming than the air she breathes. You repeat the inspection with the second jess, and then you check the small leather beweet that holds the bell to her tail feather, the same deck feather you examined during the morning's inspection. The beweet is a thin strip of fine calf skin, much softer than the jesses, and it passes through a tiny slit in the bell's brass loop and then through a second slit in the feather, fastening with a miniature knot that sits neat and flat against the feather's shaft. You test the knot with the lightest possible touch, finding it secure but not tight, and you confirm that the bell still rings freely with its faint silvery note. Satisfied, you straighten up, and the goshawk seems to take this as a signal that the disturbance is over, because she tucks her beak into her shoulder feathers and lets out a long, slow breath that fluffs the down around her nape. The cleaning of the brass scale is the next task, a quieter, more delicate chore that takes you across the mews to where the apparatus still hangs from its oak beam. The scale, which you had left with the needle oscillating after you removed the bird, has long since come to rest, and now it hangs in perfect equilibrium with the padded weighing perch still attached to the tray. You unhook the tray from its chains, setting it aside on the work table, and you take a soft, dry cloth from the shelf, a square of undyed linen that you keep for polishing the brass. The metal of the scale is tarnished in places, especially around the fulcrum and along the edges of the balance arm where your fingers have touched it most often, and the polish of the morning's use has left a faint, fingerprint-shaped bloom on the surface. You rub the cloth over the balance arm first, working in long, gentle strokes that follow the grain of the brass, and the tarnish lifts slowly, revealing the bright, warm gleam underneath. The process requires no pressure, only patience and repetition, and you find the same calm, mind-emptying quality in this work that you find in all the other tasks of the mews. The cloth darkens with residues of tarnish and oil, and you turn it to a clean section every few strokes, continuing until the entire balance arm glows with a soft, buttery light that catches the candle flame and reflects it in a narrow, golden line. You polish the faceplate next, working carefully around the engraved numbers and the notches, and then the fine chains, which you run through the cloth one link at a time, a slow, meditative process that occupies many minutes and produces a clean, silky smoothness under your fingers. When the scale is polished to your satisfaction, you wipe down the wooden tray of the weighing perch with a separate dry cloth, removing any dust or feather fragments that may have settled there, and you rehang the tray from the chains, checking that the 3 hooks engage properly and that the whole assembly swings freely. You nudge the tray with one finger, setting it swaying in a gentle pendulum motion that will continue for several minutes, and you watch the needle trace its slow arc back towards 0 as the motion decays. The scale is now clean and ready for the evening weighing, and you allow yourself a single, quiet nod of satisfaction before moving on to the final task. The water dish, which sits on the stone ledge beside the goshawk's block, has held the same pool of cool water since last evening, and its surface is now dusted with a fine, almost invisible film of feather particles and a single small speck of down that floats in the center. You lift the dish carefully, a shallow vessel of unglazed red clay that fits easily in the palm of your hand, and you carry it to the work table, where the clay jug of fresh water waits. The old water you pour carefully into the scrap bucket, tilting the dish slowly so that the down feather and the dust pour out with the liquid and leave the clay clean and damp. You dry the inside of the dish with a corner of the linen cloth, rubbing the rough porous surface until it is merely cool to the touch, and then you hold it under the spout of the clay jug and tilt the jug to release a thin, clear stream of fresh water. The water rises in the dish with a soft, trickling sound, and you fill it to just below the rim, the level at which the goshawk can drink comfortably without spilling. You carry the refilled dish back to the stone ledge, setting it in exactly the same spot where it has sat every day since the Baron left, and you check that it is stable and that the surface of the water is perfectly still. The goshawk, still drowsing on her block, does not stir at the small sound of the dish being placed, but you know that later, when she wakes from her afternoon sleep, she will step down to the ledge and dip her beak into the water, raising her head to let it trickle down her throat. The sight of this, you have learned, is one of the quiet, unremarkable rhythms of the mews, a moment of ordinary life that needs no witness. All the main tasks of the mid-morning tending are now complete. The sand has been scraped and renewed, the perch inspected and smoothed, the jesses checked, the scale polished, and the water refreshed. But the tending of the mews is never truly finished, because a place like this requires constant, gentle attention, a series of small adjustments that fill the hours without ever demanding urgency. You pick up the besom of birch twigs that leans in the corner, a bundle of stiff, dried branches bound to a handle of ashwood, and you sweep the straw floor with slow, even strokes, gathering the loose bits of straw, the drifted dust, and the tiny fallen feathers into a pile near the door. The besom makes a soft, scratchy sound as it moves, a sound that is almost like the whisper of the scraper in the sand, but higher and drier, and it leaves the floor looking neat and ordered. You collect the sweepings into the bucket, adding them to the spent sand and the scraps from the earlier preparation, and you set the bucket outside the door to be carried to the midden later. You wipe the work table one last time with a damp cloth, clean the earthenware feeding dish, and set it upside down to dry, and hang the leather gauntlet on its peg with the cuff turned up so that the inside can air. The tools of the mews are all restored to their proper places. The surfaces are clean, and the only things left to do are the smallest possible acts: replenishing the kindling beside the brazier from the stack in the corner, straightening the folded leather hoods on the shelf, and pinching the spent wick of the candle so that it burns more cleanly. You do these things with the same slow, methodical care, and by the time you are finished, the mews has settled into a state of quiet perfection that will last until the evening tasks begin. You stand in the center of the room, the besom now returned to its corner, and you look around at the tidy, ordered space, the fresh, pale sand under the block, the gleaming brass scale, the clear water in its clay dish, the goshawk dozing on her perch with her feathers puffed slightly to trap the warmth. The light from the high window has shifted subtly, the silver tones of the morning giving way to a warmer, yellower light that signals the approach of midday, and the brazier continues its slow, steady glow, the birch log now collapsed into a heap of white powdered embers. You feel the pleasant, deep fatigue that follows a morning of quiet industry, a fatigue that is not tiredness but satisfaction, and you know that the next part of the day will be the longest and quietest of all. The slow, empty hours of the afternoon, when the castle and the mews and the goshawk, and you will all rest together in the deep, unbroken peace of an autumn day in the year 1195. The morning has passed without any marker more distinct than the slow shift of light across the stone wall and the gradual settling of the brazier's embers into a bed of soft, white ash. Outside the mews, the castle has moved through its own quiet routines, and now, as the sun climbs toward its highest point in the autumn sky, the whole household seems to pause, drawing inward toward the midday rest that follows the main meal. Inside the mews, the stillness is even deeper, a thick, layered quiet that is accumulated through the long hours of weighing, preparing, feeding, and tending, and that now wraps around every object in the room like a heavy, woolen blanket. The goshawk, her crop now visibly smaller than it was at the end of the feeding, has slipped into a deep, motionless sleep on her block, her head drawn down between her shoulders and her feathers fluffed out to trap the warmth of her body. You've been sitting on the cushion of straw against the warmest wall, your own breathing slow and even, your hands resting loosely in your lap, letting the stillness of the mews seep into your bones. It is during this long suspended interval of rest that you notice a single, pale object on the sand below the block, something that was not there when you finished the morning's cleaning. You rise from the straw cushion and cross the room to investigate, finding a small curved sliver of keratin, translucent and faintly blue tin shaped like a tiny canoe. It is a feather sheath, the protective casing that surrounded a growing pin feather, and that the goshawk has nibbled away during her preening, and its presence on the clean sand tells you that the bird's moult is progressing at its own slow, steady pace. The discovery shifts your attention toward a task you had not planned, but that now seems entirely natural, a closer inspection of the goshawk's moult progress, a quiet, careful examination of the new feathers that are slowly replacing the old. You already examined her plumage once today, in the early morning when the candle was the only strong light and your focus was on her general condition. That inspection was broad and practical, concerned with the health of the bird as a whole. This inspection, which you will conduct now in the stronger light of midday, will be narrower and more particular, focused specifically on the moult. The new pin feathers emerging from the skin, the half-grown feathers still sheathed in their pale blue casings, and the fully emerged feathers whose barbs are still soft and unfolding. The molt is a slow, gradual process that will continue for many weeks, and its progress must be monitored with the same patient, unhurried attention you bring to every other task. You approach the goshawk, where she dozes on her block, her sleep so deep that she does not stir at the sound of your footsteps. The light from the high window now falls at a steeper angle than it did in the morning, creating a broader, more diffuse illumination that fills the center of the mews with a soft golden glow. You decide not to lift the bird from her perch. Instead, you will conduct the inspection with her standing on the block, moving around her slowly and lifting each wing with gentle, supportive hands. This will take longer than if you held her on your fist, but it will be less disruptive to her rest, and time is the one thing you have in abundance. You begin by standing directly in front of her, looking at her head and face with a closer attention than you gave during the morning's general inspection. The feathers of her crown, which lie flat and smooth in overlapping rows, are interspersed with several new pin feathers, their shafts still wrapped in the pale blue keratin sheaths that protect the growing feather within. Each pin feather rises from the skin like a tiny, smooth quill, and you can see the dark tip of the emerging feather just beginning to push through the end of the sheath. You count the pin feathers on her head, touching none of them but letting your gaze travel slowly across her crown, noting the even distribution and the healthy, pale color of the sheaths. A few of the pins are further along than others, their tips already showing the soft, dark barbs of the new feather, while others are still tightly sealed, their contents hidden. This variation is normal. The molt is not a single synchronized event, but a slow, scattered process that moves across the body in waves. From the head, you move your attention downward, tracing the line of her nape and the back of her neck, areas that are difficult for her to prehend herself, and that often hold the most advanced signs of the molt. You gently part the feathers with the tip of your little finger, exposing the skin beneath, and you see several more pin feathers here. Their sheaths are pale, waxy blue-white against the darker grey of the surrounding plumage. Some of these pins are very new, barely emerged from the skin, while others are longer and more developed, their tips already crumbling away to release the feather within. The skin itself is clean and pale pink, free of any irritation or swelling around the feather follicles, a sign that the molt is progressing without complication. Now you move to her right wing, the part of the bird where the molt is most visible and most critical. You reach out with your right hand and place your thumb and forefinger lightly around the shoulder joint, the same gentle grip you used during the morning's inspection, and you apply the smallest outward pressure. The goshawk stirs from her sleep, her eyes opening a crack and her head lifting slightly, but she does not resist. She knows this touch, and she allows her wing to be extended just far enough to expose the full length of the primary flight feathers and their coverts. You hold the wing steady with one hand while you use the other to examine the feathers in detail, letting your fingertip travel slowly along the edge of the wing. The 10 primary feathers, the long, stiff feathers that form the outer edge of the wing and that provide the power for flight, are in various stages of replacement. The outermost primary, the smallest and most distal, is old and worn, its tip slightly frayed and its color faded to a pale brownish gray. It will likely be the next to drop. The second primary is newer, a fresh dark feather with a strong glossy shaft and clean unbroken edges, fully emerged from its sheath and now hardening into its final form. The third primary is a pin feather at an intermediate stage, still half enclosed in its blue sheath, the tip of the feather emerging in a soft, dark brush that will unfold into barbs over the coming days. The fourth, fifth, and sixth primaries are all new feathers. In various stages of hardening, their colors are rich, deep slate that contrasts with the paler, older feathers they are replacing. The seventh primary is missing entirely, having dropped perhaps 3 or 4 days ago, and in its place a new pin feather is just beginning to push through the skin. A tiny pale nub, no larger than a grain of barley. The 8th, 9th, and 10th primaries are old, their edges worn and their shafts slightly softened by months of use, but they are still firmly attached and will remain until the new feathers in the sequence have grown long enough to take their place. This pattern, in which the molt proceeds in a wave from the inner primaries outward, is exactly what the old falconer taught you to expect. The bird loses and replaces her flight feathers in a carefully orchestrated sequence that ensures she is never left with a gap large enough to impair her ability to fly. Each dropped feather is replaced by a new pin that grows slowly over many weeks, and the whole cycle takes the better part of half a year to complete. You run your finger along the edge of the wing again, feeling the alternating textures of old and new, and you silently count the feathers, fixing the pattern in your memory so that you can compare it to the next inspection. The coverts, the smaller feathers that overlay the bases of the primaries, are also molting, and you find several new pin feathers among them, their sheaths pale and waxy against the darker, established feathers. You gently lift one of the new covert feathers, examining the way the barbs are beginning to unfurl from the tip of the sheath like a tiny dark flower opening. The feather is still soft and pliable, its shaft filled with blood and nutrients that will recede as the feather hardens, and you handle it with extreme care, knowing that a developing pin feather is fragile and easily damaged. You release the covert and let it settle back into place, and then you turn your attention to the secondary feathers, which lie closer to the body and which molt in a separate, slower sequence of their own. The secondaries are in a similar state of mixed progress. Some are old and worn, some are new and glossy, and some are missing, replaced by pin feathers at various stages of growth. You count the secondaries, noting which ones have dropped and which are still in place, and you compare the pattern to what you remember from the last thorough molt inspection a week ago. The changes are small but definite. 2 new pins have appeared where there were none before, and one half-grown feather has now fully emerged and is beginning to harden. The pace of the molt is slow, almost imperceptible from day to day, but over a week the cumulative effect is visible, a quiet, steady renewal that will leave the bird with a complete, fresh set of feathers by the time the winter arrives. You release the right wing and let it fold back into place, and the goshawk gives a small, sleepy shake of her entire body, rousing slightly from her doze to preen a feather at the shoulder that you disturbed during the examination. You wait, letting her finish, and then you move around to her other side and repeat the process with the left wing. The left wing shows a similar pattern of molt, with the same sequence of old, new, and missing feathers, but you notice that the 7th primary on this side has already dropped and been replaced by a pin feather that is slightly more advanced than the one on the right, its tip already showing a small dark brush of emerging barbs. This asymmetry is normal. The 2 wings do not always molt in perfect synchrony, and the small differences will even out over time. After examining both wings, you turn your attention to the tail, the 12 long barred feathers that fan out behind the bird and that provide her with balance and steering in flight. The tail molts in its own separate pattern, typically beginning with the central pair and progressing outward, and you gently lift the tail to examine the feathers at their bases. The central deck feather, the one that holds the bell, is old and slightly worn at the tip, but it is still firmly attached and will likely remain for several more weeks. The 2 feathers on either side of it are new, fully emerged and hardening, their barring clean and sharp, and the next pair outward are pin feathers at an advanced stage, their sheaths crumbling away to reveal the dark, banded feathers within. The outermost tail feathers on both sides are old and worn, and one of them, on the left side, is loose enough that it will probably drop within the next few days. You test it gently, feeling the slight give in the follicle, and you let it be, knowing that the bird will shed it naturally when the time is right. You release the tail and step back, giving the goshawk a moment to resettle. She shakes her whole body again, a longer, more thorough shake that begins at her head and travels down through her wings and tail, and then she tucks her beak into her shoulder feathers and closes her eyes, dismissing you and your inspection with the absolute indifference of a sleepy hawk. You take this as a sign that the examination is complete, and you walk slowly back to the work table, where you pour a small splash of water into a cup and drink it, feeling the cool liquid ease a dryness in your throat that you had not noticed before. The molt inspection has added another layer of knowledge to the quiet store of information you keep about the bird, a store that includes her weight, her appetite, the condition of her feathers, the state of her jesses, and the rhythm of her days. None of this information is written down. The Baron took his Falconry ledger with him to the Holy Land, and you have no parchment or ink in the mews. Instead, you carry everything in your memory, a living record that grows and shifts with each passing day. The molt will continue, the feathers will grow, and you will watch it all with the same patient, unhurried attention, asking nothing more of the bird than what she gives naturally, the slow, quiet spectacle of her own renewal. You return to your straw cushion against the warm wall, settling back into the comfortable, supported position you occupied before the inspection. The goshawk dozes on, her breathing so shallow that her breast barely moves, and the mews is so quiet that you can hear the faint, distant sound of the midday bell ringing from the chapel tower, a single, low note that rolls across the bailey and through the stone walls like a slow wave through deep water. The note lingers for a long moment and then fades, and the silence that follows is even deeper than before. You close your eyes and let your own breathing fall into rhythm with the birds, a slow, steady pulse that asks nothing of the afternoon but stillness, and the autumn of 195 continues its quiet, unhurried passage outside the high, barred window. The midday bell has faded, its single low note dissolving into the stone walls and the thatch roof and the deep, layered silence of the mews. And now the long afternoon begins. This is the emptiest part of the day, the span of hours between the morning's tasks and the evening's weighing, when the castle and its household sink into a slow, digestive rest, and the goshawk, her crop still holding the last of her meal, enters a state of almost complete stillness. You remain on your straw cushion against the warmest wall, your back supported by the sun-heated stones, and your legs stretched out before you, crossed at the ankles, and you let the afternoon settle around you like a slow, warm tide. There is nothing you need to do, nothing that calls for your attention, and the absence of obligation is itself a kind of quiet luxury that you have learned to appreciate during the Baron's long absence. The goshawk stands on her block in the posture of deep rest that you have come to know so well. Both feet are planted now because the weight of her full crop pulls her body slightly forward and requires a broader stance for balance. But her head is drawn down between her shoulders and her feathers are puffed out to twice their usual thickness, trapping a layer of warm air against her skin. Her eyes are closed, the dark lids sealed shut, and only the faintest tremor of the feathers around her nostrils shows that she is breathing at all. She looks like a stuffed bird in a lord's cabinet of curiosities, too still to be real, and yet she is real, alive and warm, and slowly, slowly digesting the pigeon you fed her. You watch her without staring, your gaze resting on her form as lightly as a fallen leaf rests on still water, and you feel your own breathing, slow to match the rhythm of hers. The light inside the mews has changed again, and it will continue to change throughout the afternoon. A slow, imperceptible shift that you will notice only when you look up after a long interval and find that the shadows have moved. Right now, in the first part of the afternoon, the sun is high enough that its direct rays no longer fall through the high barred window. Instead, the light enters at a steep angle and reflects off the pale stone of the outer wall, bouncing into the mews as a diffuse golden glow that fills the space without casting strong shadows. The beam that marked the morning's hours, the column of light that fell across the sand and illuminated the floating dust, has disappeared entirely, and in its place is a softer, more even illumination that makes the straw on the floor look pale and colourless, and the brass scale gleam with a quiet, muted lustre. The candle on the work table still burns because you have not snuffed it, and its flame is now a pale, nearly invisible ghost in the stronger ambient light, a small, wavering shape that you can see only when you look directly at it. The warmth in the mews has increased by a small degree, partly from the sun-heated wall against which you lean, and partly from the brazier, which continues its slow, steady output of heat, even though the birch log has now collapsed entirely into a bed of glowing coals. The air is dry and still, carrying the blended scents that have become as familiar to you as your own skin. The clean, sharp smell of the river sand, the dusty sweetness of the dried lavender on the work table, the faint animal warmth of the goshawk's feathers, and the mild, woody smoke of the brazier. These scents combine into a single harmonious atmosphere that is the smell of the mews itself, a smell you would recognize anywhere, a smell that means safety and quiet and the slow, predictable passage of an ordinary day. You have brought a small cup of ale and a heel of barley bread from the kitchen earlier, carrying them back to the mews after your trip to the larder, and now you reach for them where they sit on the stone ledge beside your cushion. The cup is a simple, unglazed earthenware vessel, its rim slightly uneven from the potter's wheel, and the ale inside is dark and cool and smells faintly of malt and herbs. You take a sip, letting the liquid spread across your tongue, and you feel the small, pleasant bitterness of it, a taste that is both refreshing and grounding. The bread is dense and chewy, its crust dark and hard from the oven, and you tear off a small piece and eat it slowly, tasting the nutty flavor of the barley and the faint salty tang of the butter that the cook spread on it that the morning. You eat without hunger, more for the quiet comfort of the act than for any need of sustenance, and you take your time, chewing each mouthful thoroughly and pausing between bites. From somewhere beyond the curtain wall, the sound of the blacksmith's hammer reaches you again, but it is different now than it was in the morning. The rhythm is slower, more intermittent, the strokes separated by long pauses in which the smith is probably examining his work, or turning the iron in the forge. The sound comes to you muffled and softened, translated by the stone walls and the distance into a series of low, dull thuds that are more like a heartbeat than a hammer, a slow, regular pulse that blends into the background of the afternoon. You listen to it without concentration, letting it become part of the larger texture of silence, and after a while it stops altogether, and the silence that follows is even deeper than before. The afternoon is the time when your mind, freed from the small, focused tasks of the morning, is free to wander, and you let it wander without direction or purpose. You think about the Baron, far away in the Holy Land, somewhere beyond the sea that you have never seen. You picture him in his tent of blue and gold, his goshawks on their perches beside him, his servants moving quietly through the same routines you perform here. You wonder if the sun is hotter there, if the dust is finer, if the birds he flies are different from the one you tend. But these thoughts are not urgent or troubling. They drift through your mind like clouds across a still sky, arriving and departing without leaving any trace. The Baron will return or he will not, and in the meantime the goshawk needs her daily care, and the mews needs its cleaning, and the seasons will turn regardless of who is master of the castle and who is away at war. You shift your position on the straw cushion, turning slightly so that you can see the window and the square of sky beyond. The sky is still that same flat, depthless blue, but the quality of the light has begun to change. The sharp, bright gold of midday softening toward a warmer, mellower tone that hints at the approach of evening, though evening is still many hours away. A single small cloud, the first you have seen all day, drifts slowly across the square of blue, a thin, frayed wisp of white that stretches and thins as it moves, and you watch it until it disappears beyond the edge of the window frame. Then the sky is empty again, and you let your gaze drop back to the interior of the mews. The goshawk has shifted slightly on her perch. Her crop is visibly smaller now, the bulge at the base of her throat having reduced as the food passes from the crop into the stomach, and her posture has changed to accommodate the new distribution of weight. She lifts one foot and tucks it into her breast feathers, the same one-footed resting pose she uses when her crop is empty, and she opens her eyes a crack, revealing a thin crescent of orange beneath the dark lids. She looks at you or in your direction, and then she closes her eyes again, dismissing you as irrelevant to her current state of warm, drowsy contentment. You feel a small, quiet affection for her in this moment, an affection that is not based on any particular quality or behavior, but simply on the fact of her presence, the steady, living warmth of another creature sharing the same peaceful afternoon. You finish the last of your bread and ale, setting the cup aside on the ledge and brushing the crumbs from your tunic with a few slow sweeps of your hand. The crumbs fall into the straw and will be swept up later, part of the endless, gentle cycle of mess and cleaning that defines life in the mews. You consider for a moment whether there is anything useful you could do to fill the afternoon hours, some small task you might undertake, but the thought passes quickly because there is truly nothing that needs doing. The sand is fresh, the water is clean, the scale is polished, the jesses are sound, and the bird is resting exactly as she should. The afternoon is meant to be empty, and you accept its emptiness with the same calm, unstriving acceptance you bring to everything else. The silence inside the mews is so complete now that you can hear the tiny, rustling sound of the goshawk's feathers as she shifts again on her perch, a sound like dry leaves stirring in a breeze. You can hear the faint, papery whisper of the candle flame as it consumes the tallow, a sound so small it is barely a sound at all. You can hear your own breathing, slow and even, the air moving in and out of your lungs with a gentle, rhythmic susurration that seems to blend with the other small noises until they are all part of a single, continuous texture. And beneath everything you can hear the deep, foundational silence of the stone walls, the thatch roof, the packed earth under the straw, a silence that has been accumulating in this place for generations and that will continue to accumulate long after you are gone. Time passes in the mews without any measure except the slow migration of the light across the wall. The patch of diffuse gold that fell on the eastern side of the room has shifted westward by a hand's breadth, and the shadows under the perches have deepened slightly, their edges softening as the light becomes more oblique. You watch the movement of the light with a detached, peaceful attention, noting the way it changes the appearance of familiar objects. The stack of straw bales, which looked pale and bright an hour ago, now stands in a deeper, more muted shade. The brass scale, which gleamed with a warm luster, now catches the light at a different angle and shows a single, narrow stripe of brightness along its balance arm. The sack of river sand, which was in full light, has now retreated into shadow, its texture less distinct than before. These small transformations happen so gradually that you cannot see them occurring. You can only note from time to time that they have occurred and accept them as part of the afternoon's slow, inexorable drift toward evening. The goshawk has now entered the deepest phase of her afternoon sleep, a state so profound that she does not stir at the small sounds you make when you shift your weight or scratch your chin. Her head has sunk lower, her beak resting on the feathers of her breast, and her breathing is so shallow that the movement of her body is almost invisible. The only sign that she is alive is the very slight, periodic tremor of the deck feather that holds the bell, a tiny vibration that occurs each time her heart beats and that makes the bell give a faint, silvery chime so quiet you feel it more than hear it. You watch her for a long, peaceful interval, and you think about the strange, wonderful fact of her existence. This wild creature who has chosen, through the slow alchemy of falconry, to accept your presence and your care, to accept your presence and your care, to eat from your hand and stand on your glove and sleep in your company, as if you were a tree or a rock or any other safe, unthreatening feature of her world. The afternoon wears on, and the quality of the light continues its slow, subtle transformation. The golden tones of midday have given way to a softer, more amber light, and the shadows have grown longer and more blue. Outside a window, the square of sky has deepened slightly, the pale, flat blue taking on a faint, warm tint near the horizon that is invisible from your angle, but that you know is there because you have watched the sky change at this hour many times before. The castle, which was quiet during the midday rest, has begun to stir again. You hear, very faintly, the sound of a door opening somewhere in the bailey, the distant voice of a servant calling to another, the clank of the well chain as someone draws water for the evening meal. These sounds are not disruptive. They're simply the background music of the castle's daily life, a quiet, familiar melody that plays beneath the deeper silence of the mews. You rise from your straw cushion, not because you need to do anything, but because your legs have grown stiff from sitting and you want to stretch them before the evening tasks begin. You walk slowly around the perimeter of the mews, your footsteps making the same soft, shushing sound in the straw, and you pass the row of empty perches, the stack of straw bales, the scrap bucket by the door, the sack of fresh sand, and the work table with its orderly arrangement of tools. Everything is as it should be, clean and quiet and waiting. You stop at the brazier and use a small iron poker to stir the coals, bringing a fresh glow to their surfaces and releasing a brief, warm wave of heat that washes over your face and hands. Then you add a single new log, a piece of split birch, and you watch as the bark catches and curls, and a small, bright flame springs up along its edge. The goshawk stirs at the sound of the fire catching, her eyes opening a little wider and her head lifting from her breast. She looks at you across the mews, and her gaze is clear and calm, the deep orange eyes bright with the alertness that follows a long sleep. Her crop is almost entirely flat now, just a slight soft fullness at the base of her throat, and you know that by the time you weigh her in the evening, the digestion will be complete, and her weight will have settled to its true, empty figure. She stretches one wing, extending it downward and outward in a slow, luxurious fan that shows the full length of her flight feathers, and then she stretches the other wing And then she shakes her whole body with a vigorous, ruffling shudder that ends with every feather lying perfectly flat and smooth. She is awake now, and the afternoon's long doze is over, and soon it will be time to begin the evening routine, the weighing, the offering of water, the hooding, and the closing of the mews for the night. But not quite yet. There is still a little time left, a final, quiet interval before the day turns toward its ending, and you spend it standing by the brazier, watching the goshawk watch you, while the soft, amber light of the autumn afternoon fills the mews and the world outside the high window continues its slow, peaceful turn toward dusk. The amber light of the late afternoon has begun its final, gentle fade toward dusk, and the square of sky visible through the high, barred window has deepened from pale blue to a soft, greyish gold that carries the first hint of evening. Inside the mews, the shadows have grown longer and darker, stretching out from the perches and the work table and the stack of straw bales, like slow dark water spreading across the floor. The goshawk, now fully awake after her long afternoon sleep, stands on her block with both feet planted and her eyes open and clear, watching you with the same calm, unblinking attention she gave you in the morning. Her crop is flat, the last of the pigeon having passed into her stomach during the quiet hours of the afternoon, and she looks keen and alert, ready for the evening's small rituals before the night's long rest begins. You rise from the straw cushion where you have spent the better part of the afternoon and stretch your arms slowly, feeling the pleasant pull of muscles that have been still for too long. The brazier, which you fed with a fresh birch log a little while ago, is burning steadily, its flames casting a warm, flickering glow that is becoming more prominent as the daylight fades. You cross to the work table and lift the candle holder, touching the wick to the brazier's embers until it catches, and then you set the candle back on the table, where its flame joins the brazier's glow in pushing back the gathering shadows. The mews, which was filled with soft, diffuse light all afternoon, is now becoming a place of small, bright points of illumination surrounded by deepening darkness, and the change feels appropriate for the end of the day. The evening weighing is the first of the closing rituals, a repetition of the morning's task that will give you the day's final piece of information about the bird's condition. You pull the leather gauntlet onto your left hand, the glove still slightly warm from the morning's use, and you check the brass scale where it hangs from its oak beam. The scale is still and level, the needle pointing to 0 after the polishing and calibrating you performed earlier, and the padded weighing perch is still attached to the tray, its felt surface clean and undisturbed. Everything is ready, and the task ahead is so familiar that your body moves through it without any need for conscious direction. You approach the goshawk with the same slow, steady gait you have used all day, and she watches you come with her head held high and her feathers lying smooth and flat. When you press the back of your gloved hand against her breast, she steps up immediately, her talons gripping the glove with a firm, even pressure, and you lift her from the block and carry her across the mews to where the scale hangs waiting. The transfer to the weighing perch follows the same seamless sequence it followed in the morning. You hold the jesses lightly between your thumb and forefinger. Lower your fist until the bird's breast touches the padded crossbar, and let her step onto the perch with a single, smooth motion. She settles onto the felt, her feet finding their familiar grip, and you withdraw your hand and stand back, keeping the jesses slack in your fingers while the scale finds its balance. The needle begins its slow decaying oscillation, swinging from side to side in arcs that gradually shorten, and you wait with the same patient stillness you bring to every weighing. The light from the candle on the work table does not quite reach this corner of the mews, but the brazier's glow is strong enough to illuminate the brass faceplate and the moving needle, and you watch the tiny, regular swing with a calm, detached attention. The chains tinkle softly against one another, the beam creaks once and settles, and the needle's arc shrinks from a span of several inches to a narrow, rhythmic tremor that traces the same tiny path over and over. When it settles at last, the reading is 2 pounds and 9 ounces, exactly the same weight you recorded in the morning. The bird has neither gained nor lost during the day. Her single meal has been digested perfectly, and her body is in the same keen, balanced condition it was in when the sun rose. You hold the number in your mind for a moment, feeling the quiet satisfaction of a steady, unchanged measurement, and then you lift the goshawk from the weighing perch with the same gentle transfer you used before. She steps onto your glove willingly, her weight settling against your arm with a familiar, reassuring heaviness, and you carry her back toward her block. But instead of placing her on the perch immediately, you pause beside the stone ledge where the water dish sits, its surface still and clear, and you hold her near it so that she can drink if she wishes. She looks at the water for a long moment, her head cocked slightly, and then she leans down and dips her beak into the dish, tilting her head back to let the cool liquid run down her throat. She drinks 3 times, each time raising her head and swallowing with a small, rippling motion of her throat, and then she straightens up and looks away, signaling that she has had enough. You set her on the block, and she steps off your glove with the same calm, deliberate motion she's used all day, her talons finding the familiar depressions in the felt, and her body settling into its usual posture. The evening is now moving toward its close, and there is only one more task to perform before the mews can be shut for the night: the hooding. The hood is a small, finely crafted cap of soft leather, shaped to fit the contours of the goshawk's head and to cover her eyes without pressing on them. It is a tool of calmness, a way of telling the bird that the day is over and that it is time to sleep, and you take it from the shelf where it rests among the other hoods. The Baron left behind, handling it with the same gentle care you give to every object in the mews. The hood is made of dark brown calfskin, worn supple by use, and it is decorated with a small, elegant plume of blue jay feather that curls over the crown. You turn it over in your hands, checking that the inside is clean and that the small leather braces that will hold it in place are tight and sound. And then you approach the goshawk with the hood held in your right hand. She sees it coming, and she does not flinch or pull away. She has been hooded every evening of her life, and the sight of the leather cap is as familiar to her as the sight of your glove. You hold the hood just in front of her face for a moment, letting her recognize it, and then you slip it over her head with a single, smooth motion, drawing the braces gently behind her head and settling the soft leather over her eyes. The effect of the hood is immediate and profound. The goshawk's body, which was alert and upright a moment before, relaxes visibly, her feathers puffing out slightly, and her head sinking down toward her shoulders. The hood blocks all light and all movement, and the bird, deprived of sight, enters a state of calm, trusting stillness that is not quite sleep, but is deeper than mere rest. You adjust the fit of the hood with your fingertips, making sure that the beak is free and that the leather is not pressing on the ceria, and then you step back and observe her standing on her block, a quiet, hooded figure whose entire world has been reduced to the feel of the perch under her feet, the sound of your breathing, and the slow, steady warmth of the mews. The hooding is the last direct interaction you will have with the goshawk today, but the evening's tasks are not quite complete. You walk to the corner of the mews where a length of coarse linen cloth hangs from a peg, a simple draft screen that you use to cover the bird's perch at night and protect her from any cold air that might seep through the window or under the door. The cloth is heavy and undyed. It's weaved tight and its edges hemmed with thick, even stitches, and you carry it to the block and drape it carefully over the wooden frame that stands behind the perch. The cloth falls in soft, loose folds, enclosing the goshawk on 3 sides and leaving the front open toward the brazier, so that the warmth can reach her while the cooler air is kept at bay. Inside the small fabric-walled space, the hooded bird settles even further into stillness, her breathing slow and deep. Now you turn your attention to the mews itself, performing the final, quiet chores that will leave the room ready for the night. You sweep the floor with the birch besom, gathering the day's small accumulations of straw dust, feather fragments, and scattered sand into a neat pile near the door, and you scoop the pile into the scrap bucket. You check the brazier, adding a last split log and arranging the coals so they will burn slowly and steadily through the night, providing a constant, gentle warmth. You snuff the candle on the work table with the iron snuffer, extinguishing the flame with a small hiss and a curl of smoke, and you stand for a moment in the dim, fire-lit darkness, listening to the silence of the mews and the faint, distant sounds of the castle settling in for the night. The last task is to wash your hands as you always do before leaving, and you pour a little water from the clay jug into the basin and rinse off the day's invisible residues of leather, feather, meat, and ash. You dry your hands on the linen cloth, Rub a final, crushed stem of lavender between your palms and hang the cloth back on its peg. Then you go to the door, pausing with your hand on the iron latch, and you look back across the mews one final time. The brazier glows orange and warm, its light touching the edges of the perches and the gleam of the brass scale. The goshawk is a dark, still shape behind her linen draught screen, silent and peaceful. The sand under her block is clean and pale, the water dish is full, and the whole room is ordered and quiet. A small, perfect world contained within stone walls and a thatch roof. You lift the latch and pull the heavy oak door open, stepping out into the bailey as the last light of evening fades from the sky. The air outside is cool and fresh after the warmth of the mews, and it carries the smell of wood smoke from the kitchen chimney and the faint, clean scent of the dew already beginning to form on the cobbles. The castle is dark and silent, its windows shuttered, its inhabitants withdrawn into their chambers and their beds. A single guard stands at the gatehouse, his pike a thin dark line against the deep blue of the sky, and somewhere a dog barks once and then is silent. You close the mews door behind you with a soft, careful thud, feeling the latch fall into place, and you stand for a moment on the threshold, looking up at the first faint stars beginning to appear overhead. The day is over. The goshawk is fed and weighed and hooded and warm. The mews is clean and quiet. The baron is still far away, somewhere beyond the sea, and the autumn of 1195 is moving slowly toward winter. You carry with you the small, quiet knowledge of a day spent in steady, patient labor, a day filled with the weight of a bird on your glove, and the feel of brass under your fingers, and the sight of light moving across a stone wall. You walk across the dark bailey toward your own small bed in the servants' quarters, your footsteps quiet on the cooling cobbles, and you feel the deep, calm tiredness of a day well spent settling into your limbs. Tomorrow you will wake and do it all again. The same tasks in the same order, the same slow, peaceful rhythm, and you will do it gladly, because this is the life of a falconer's apprentice, a life of quiet care and patient waiting, a life lived in the deep, unbroken peace of a castle mews in the year 185.